Hello there, and welcome to Factonium Facts Unlocked. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into wherever you're resting. There's nowhere else you need to be right now. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the day finally ends. A cozy corner where you can let go of everything that came before. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Tonight we're going to explore something remarkable and surprisingly intimate. Life aboard a medieval merchant ship. Not the great warships you might imagine, not the vessels of conquest or exploration, but the working ships that carried wool and wine, salt and silk across the medieval seas. We'll discover what it meant to live for weeks or months on a wooden vessel, no larger than a modern school bus, to navigate by stars and instinct, to trust your life to oak planks and hempen rope. It's a world that existed for centuries, carrying the lifeblood of a medieval commerce across waters both familiar and terrifying. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a tale of storms and shipwrecks, of pirates and battles at sea. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the daily rhythms of maritime life, understanding the skills and knowledge that kept these ships afloat, the relationships that formed between men living in impossibly close quarters, the quiet courage required simply to sail from one port to another. By the end, I think you'll find a deep appreciation for these forgotten mariners who connected the medieval world. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here. Your presence means more than you might know, so settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath. And let it out even more slowly. And let's begin our slow drift across medieval waters. There's nothing you need to do. Just listen and let the story unfold like a sail catching the wind. The merchant ship that would carry you across medieval waters was most likely a cog, that sturdy workhorse of northern European trade. Picture a vessel perhaps 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a single mast rising from her centre like a tree trunk. Her hull was clinker-built, each oak plank overlapping the one below in a pattern that had served northern shipwrights for 1,000 years. She sat high in the water when empty, revealing the green and brown stains where seaweed clung below the waterline. But when laden with cargo, she would settle deeper, becoming part of the sea itself. The cog was not beautiful in the way we might think of ships today. There was nothing sleek about her lines, nothing graceful in her movements. She was built like a merchant's cart, sturdy and capacious, with a flat bottom that allowed her to rest on tidal mudflats, and a high stern castle that rose above the deck like a wooden fortress. Her single square sail, when unfurled, bore the marks of countless repairs, patches of different canvas sewn together in a patchwork that told the story of her years at sea. What made the cog remarkable was her practicality. Unlike the longer, narrower ships of the Mediterranean or the sleek vessels of the Vikings, the cog was designed first and foremost to carry cargo. Her wide beam provided stability in the rough waters of the North Sea and the Baltic. Her flat bottom meant she could be loaded and unloaded on beaches where no proper harbour existed. She could be sailed with a relatively small crew, perhaps 10 to 15 men, making her economical to operate even when profits were thin. The shipwright who built her had learned his craft from his father, who had learned from his father before him. There were no written plans, no drawings or blueprints. The knowledge lived in the hands and eyes of the craftsman, in their ability to judge the curve of a timber or the strength of a joint. Every piece of oak was selected for its particular role, the natural curve of a tree becoming the curve of a hull plank, a forked branch becoming a knee brace to support the deck. Building such a ship might take a year or more, depending on the availability of timber and labour. The keel would be laid first, that central spine of oak that ran the length of the vessel. Then the planks would be added one by one, each edge carefully bevelled to overlap the next, each seam caulked with animal hair and tar to keep the water out. Iron nails, themselves expensive and precious, would be hammered through the planks into the oak frames that gave the hull its shape. The deck would be laid last, providing a working platform that covered most of the cargo hold below. And when she was finished, when the mast had been stepped and the sail bent on and the cargo loaded, she would be given a name, perhaps St. Mary or St. Christopher, perhaps Grace Dieu or God's Grace, names that asked for divine protection on waters that remained, despite all human skill and courage, fundamentally beyond human control. This was your ship then, this wooden world between heaven and hell. The master of a medieval merchant ship held authority that was absolute and yet constrained by countless unwritten rules and ancient customs. He was typically the ship's owner or part owner, a merchant mariner who had risen through years of experience to command his own vessel. His word was law aboard ship, but it was a law tempered by the knowledge that his crew's willing cooperation meant the difference between profit and disaster, between safe arrival and calamity. Picture him standing on the afterdeck, one hand resting on the tiller, eyes scanning the horizon. He might be in his 30s or 40s, his face weathered by sun and salt spray, his hands scarred from rope and timber. He wore no uniform to mark his status, just the practical wool and leather of any seaman, but everyone aboard knew him by bearing and voice. He was the one who decided when to sail and when to shelter, which cargo to accept and which to refuse, which port to make for when weather turned foul. The master's most important skill was his knowledge of waters and coastlines. In an age before accurate charts, before compasses were common, navigation depended on accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of mariners. The master knew the look of the sky before a storm, the colour of water that meant shallows beneath, the shape of distant headlands that told him where he was. He kept this knowledge partly in his head and partly in a rudder, a handwritten book of sailing directions that might have been started by his grandfather and added to by every master who had commanded the ship since. But navigation was only part of his responsibility. The master was also a merchant, responsible for finding cargo, negotiating freight rates, collecting payment, and managing the complex web of credit and obligation that underpinned medieval trade. He had to judge character quickly, knowing which merchants could be trusted and which required payment in advance. He had to understand the markets in different ports, knowing that wool bought cheaply in England might fetch a good price in Flanders, but only if he arrived before his competitors. The relationship between master and crew was unlike anything in the modern world. He was not quite their employer, since sailors were typically paid shares of the voyage's profits rather than wages. He was not quite their commander, since medieval crews expected to be consulted on major decisions and could, in extreme circumstances, refuse to obey orders they considered suicidal. He was something more like the head of a floating family, responsible for their welfare but dependent on their skills and loyalty. When conflicts arose, as they inevitably did among men living in close quarters under stress, the master served as judge. His decisions were guided by maritime law that stretched back centuries, but also by common sense and the need to maintain harmony among his crew. A man who stole from his shipmates might be put ashore at the next port. One who endangered the ship through negligence might be beaten. But harsh discipline was rare, because a resentful crew worked poorly and, in extremis, might mutiny. The master's greatest challenge was making decisions with incomplete information under enormous pressure. Should he sail when weather looked uncertain, risking the ship but potentially reaching port ahead of competitors? Should he take on more cargo than was prudent, increasing profit but decreasing stability? Should he trust the harbour pilot who offered to guide them into an unfamiliar port? Every choice carried consequences, and the master bore responsibility for all of them. This weight of constant decision-making, this burden of lives and livelihoods depending on his judgment, shaped the character of every successful shipmaster. And it's this figure we must understand to comprehend life aboard a medieval merchant ship. The common sailors who made up most of a merchant ship's crew lived lives of strange contradiction, alternating between months at sea and weeks ashore, between brutal labour and long periods of waiting, between poverty and the possibility of modest prosperity. They were drawn from coastal communities throughout northern Europe, young men mostly, who had grown up within sight and sound of the sea and saw in maritime trade their best chance for advancement. A sailor's education began in childhood. By age 7 or 8, a boy might be apprenticed to a master mariner, learning to hand and reef and steer, to splice rope and tar seams, to read wind and wave. The work was hard beyond modern imagination, requiring strength and endurance, but also precise skill. A line poorly coiled might tangle when needed most. A knot improperly tied might slip under strain. The margin for error was measured in lives. By his late teens, if he had survived disease and accident, a sailor knew his craft. He could steer by the stars on a clear night, feeling through the tiller the ship's response to wind and current. He could go aloft in a gale to reef the sail, clinging to wildly swinging rigging while canvas tried to tear itself from his hands. He could sense by the ship's motion when she was properly balanced, or when cargo had shifted below. This knowledge lived in his body, in instincts developed through years of experience, in skills that could not be fully explained in words. The sailor's day, when at sea, followed rhythms determined by wind and tide. There were no fixed watches in the modern sense, no division of the day into neat 4-hour periods. Instead, men worked when work was needed and rested when they could. In good weather with a steady wind, this might mean long hours of relative idleness, sitting on deck mending rope or sail, telling stories, sleeping in the sun. But when weather turned or difficult navigation required, every man worked until the crisis passed, whether that took hours or days. Living conditions aboard ship were primitive. There were no bunks or hammocks, no private spaces. Men slept where they could find room, wrapped in woolen cloaks, often wet, always cold. In rough weather, sleep was impossible anyway, as the ship's violent motion threw men against timbers and each other. Food was simple and, as a voyage progressed, increasingly monotonous. Salt meat, hard biscuit, dried peas, cheese, all washed down with ale, or when ale ran out, water that grew increasingly stale and foul. Yet there was companionship in this shared hardship, bonds formed between men who trusted each other with their lives. A sailor knew his shipmates in ways impossible ashore, knew their strengths and weaknesses, their habits and quirks, their courage and fears. Friendships formed aboard ship often lasted lifetimes, creating networks of mutual obligation and support that extended across ports and kingdoms. When a sailor died, his shipmates might pool money to pay for his burial or to support his widow, knowing that someday they might need the same assistance. The sailor's relationship with the sea itself was complex. He might spend his entire life on or near the water without ever learning to swim. The sea was not something to be loved or romanticized, but rather an element to be respected and feared, a force that could kill suddenly and without warning. Sailors developed elaborate superstitions about the sea, taboos about certain words or actions that might bring bad luck. They wore charms for protection and said prayers before sailing. They believed in sea monsters and ghost ships, in mermaids and krakens, in all the mysterious dangers that lurked beneath the waves. And yet, for all its dangers and hardships, sailors returned to the sea voyage after voyage. Some had no choice, lacking skills for other work. But others stayed because they had come to love the life despite everything. The freedom of the open sea, the satisfaction of skilled work well done, the camaraderie of the crew. They were, in their way, monks of the sea, bound by vows not to God but to their craft and their brothers in that craft, living lives of harsh discipline in service to something larger than themselves. The medieval merchant ship was a living thing in the minds of those who sailed her, an entity with moods and needs and personality. Understanding her meant understanding the materials from which she was made and the ancient techniques that held her together. Every timber and rope, every plank and nail had been carefully selected and shaped, each playing its role in keeping the sea outside where it belonged. Oak was the heart of the ship, the primary timber for keel and planking, for frames and knees. European shipwrights preferred oak for its strength and durability, its resistance to rot and shipworm. The best oak came from trees that had grown slowly in poor soil, developing dense, tight-grained wood that could withstand decades of stress. A shipwright could judge oak by its weight and sound, knowing without measurement whether a timber would serve or fail. But oak alone could not make a ship. Pine provided lighter timbers for masts and spars, for decking and interior structures. Elm, which resisted splitting, was used for the keel where the ship might rest on rough ground. Beech made good blocks and pulleys. Ash provided flexibility for oars and boat hooks. The medieval ship was a catalogue of trees, each species contributing its particular qualities to the whole. Tar came from pine forests, produced by burning pine wood in covered pits to drive off the volatile substances and leave behind a thick, black, sticky residue. It smelled of resin and smoke, of forests transformed into something useful for the sea. Sailors applied tar constantly, painting it on rigging to preserve rope from rot, spreading it on deck seams to keep water from the cargo below, coating the hull's exterior to protect against shipworm and decay. A well-maintained ship bore the sweet, acrid smell of tar like a perfume, announcing her seaworthiness to those who knew ships. The sail itself was woven from hemp or flax. Hundreds of square feet of heavy canvas that might weigh several £100 when dry and much more when wet. Making a sail required the work of many hands, women typically, who wove the cloth on great looms and then sewed the individual pieces together with thousands of stitches. The finished sail was reinforced with rope sewn along its edges, with leather patches where it rubbed against the mast, with rings and grommets where lines were attached. A sail might last several years if carefully maintained, but eventually the constant stress of wind would tear it beyond repair, requiring expensive replacement. Rope was everywhere aboard ship, miles of it in various sizes and purposes. Heavy cables served as anchor line and mooring lines, capable of holding the ship against current and tide. Lighter line ran through blocks to control the sail, to hoist cargo, to secure everything aboard against the sea's motion. The thinnest cords served for whipping and seizing, for repairs and countless small tasks. All of this rope was made from hemp, grown in fields across northern Europe, processed and spun and twisted into the cordage that made sailing possible. Maintaining all these materials, keeping them in working order against the constant assault of salt and water and stress, occupied much of the crew's time at sea. Sailors knew that small problems ignored became large problems quickly, that a frayed line or a loose nail might mean disaster in a storm. So they worked constantly when weather permitted, splicing and tarring, caulking and caulking, performing the endless maintenance that kept their wooden world intact. And in doing so, they participated in traditions that stretched back centuries, using techniques that their great-grandfathers would have recognized, speaking a language of timber and tar and tradition that connected them to all the sailors who had gone before. Leaving port was never a simple matter of casting off lines and sailing away. Departure required preparation that might take days or weeks, a complex choreography of loading cargo, provisioning the ship, gathering the crew, and waiting for the right combination of wind and tide. Each step had to be completed in proper order, each element checked and verified, before the master would give the command to sail. Loading cargo began days before departure, as merchants and their servants brought goods to the waterfront. Wool sacks, each weighing £300 or more, had to be hoisted aboard and carefully stowed in the hold. Packed tightly to prevent shifting, but arranged so that weight was properly distributed. Wine casks, each containing perhaps 60 gallons, were rolled aboard and secured with rope and wedges. Bales of cloth, barrels of grain, ingots of metal, all had to find their place in the dark space below deck, filling the ship until she settled deeper in the water. While cargo was loaded, the crew provisioned the ship for the voyage ahead. Fresh water was brought aboard in barrels. Enough for drinking and cooking, though never enough for washing. Salt meat came aboard in barrels as well, beef or pork that had been slaughtered months before and preserved in brine. Hard biscuit was loaded by the sack, that unleavened bread twice baked until it was rock hard, capable of lasting months without spoiling but requiring strong teeth to eat. Cheese and dried peas, onions and salt all went into the stores. Finally, when everything was ready and the wind was right and the tide was favourable, the moment came. The master gave the order. Shorelines were cast off, falling into the water with a splash. The sail was raised, its canvas filling with wind, the ship beginning to move, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as she left the shelter of the harbour. Men on the quay waved farewell. Families watched their sailors depart, wondering if they would return. And the ship, with her cargo and her crew, moved out toward the open sea, toward whatever weather and fortune awaited her there. The transition from land to sea was marked by a shift in sound and motion. The constant noise of the port, voices calling, carts rumbling, gulls crying, fell behind and was replaced by the sounds of the ship herself. The creak of timbers flexing, the splash of waves against the hull, the wind humming through the rigging. The solid stability of land gave way to the ship's motion, the rolling and pitching that would become so familiar over the coming days or weeks. And in that transition, the crew became a single entity, their individual lives subsumed into the greater life of the ship, their fates now bound together by oak and sail and the vast indifference of the sea. Once beyond the shelter of land, the medieval merchant ship entered a world governed entirely by wind and wave, by weather systems that moved across the ocean, according to patterns that sailors knew but could not predict with certainty. Reading the sky became a matter of survival, and every experienced mariner carried in his memory a catalogue of signs and portents, of clouds and winds that foretold coming conditions. The ideal wind for a medieval merchant ship was a steady breeze from astern or the quarter, strong enough to fill the square sail, but not so strong as to threaten mast or rigging. Such winds might carry the ship along at 4 or 5 knots, covering perhaps 100 miles in a day of steady sailing. The master would keep the sail full but not over full, adjusting the angle of the yard to catch the most wind without putting excessive strain on the mast. The steersman would hold course, compensating for the ship's tendency to drift downwind, feeling through the tiller the balance between wind and rudder. But the ideal was rare. More commonly, winds were either too light or too strong, from the wrong direction, or changing unpredictably. Light winds meant slow progress, the ship barely moving, the sail hanging slack and then filling again with each puff of breeze. In such conditions, the crew could only wait, drifting slowly with whatever current moved beneath them, hoping for better wind. These were days of profound stillness, when the sea stretched away in all directions like a vast mirror, when time itself seemed suspended. Strong winds brought different challenges. As the breeze increased, the master had to decide when to reduce sail, when to reef by taking in part of the canvas to reduce the area exposed to the wind. Wait too long, and the ship might be overpowered, pushed over on her side. Or the mast might break under the strain. Reef too soon, and progress would be unnecessarily slow. The decision required judgment born of experience, a feel for how much wind the ship could safely carry. Rain presented its own challenges, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards, soaking everything aboard until nothing remained dry. Sailors wrapped themselves in oiled canvas or leather, but water always found a way in, running down necks and sleeves, pooling in boots. The deck became slippery. Dangerous. Below deck, water leaked through seams despite the best caulking, dripping onto cargo and crew alike. The pumps worked constantly, 2 men pumping while others rested, maintaining the endless cycle that kept the water in the bilge from rising too high. Through all these conditions, the crew adapted and endured. They developed an intimate knowledge of their ship's behaviour in different weather, knowing how she would respond to each combination of wind and wave. They learned to sleep despite the motion, to eat despite the cold, to work despite exhaustion, and they learned, above all, to accept what they could not change, to acknowledge that wind and wave and weather were powers beyond human control, forces that could be worked with but never mastered. This acceptance, this recognition of limits shaped everything about life at sea. Finding your way across the medieval ocean was an art rather than a science, a practice based on accumulated knowledge, careful observation, and educated guesswork. The tools available to a medieval navigator were remarkably simple. Primarily his own senses, his experience, and the wisdom contained in his rudder. Yet with these limited resources, sailors made voyages of hundreds or thousands of miles, crossing open ocean with a confidence that seems almost miraculous today. The most fundamental method of navigation was dead reckoning, the calculation of position based on course and distance travelled. The steersman kept the ship on course by watching the sun during the day or certain stars at night, maintaining a constant direction as best he could. The master estimated speed by observing how quickly the ship passed floating seaweed or debris, by the sound of water rushing past the hull, by the feel of the ship's motion. An experienced mariner could estimate speed within a half knot or so, accurate enough for practical purposes. Course and speed gave distance travelled in a particular direction. The master tracked this mentally, or sometimes by making marks on a slate or in his rudder, building up a mental map of the ship's track across the sea. But this dead reckoning was subject to constant error. Current set the ship sideways, especially in coastal waters. Leeway, the ship's tendency to drift downwind, meant she never travelled exactly in the direction she pointed. These errors accumulated so that after several days at sea, the ship's actual position might differ from the dead reckoning position by many miles. To correct these errors, the navigator used every available clue about his actual position. The colour of the water told him something. Green water might mean shallows beneath. Blue water indicated deeper seas. The presence of certain seabirds suggested land was near, since different species ranged different distances from shore. Gannets and puffins meant land was very close, perhaps only a few miles away. Kittiwakes might be found 30 or 40 miles from shore. Fulmars ranged far out to sea but still indicated the general direction of land. The depth of water, measured by lead line, provided crucial information in coastal waters. The lead line was simply a rope with a weight on the end, marked at intervals with cloth or leather flags. By lowering this weight until it touched bottom, then reading the marks on the line, the navigator determined depth. But the lead provided more than depth. Its bottom was hollowed out and filled with tallow, which picked up samples of the sea floor, sand, mud, shell, gravel. These samples, compared to descriptions in the rudder, helped identify specific locations. For longer voyages into less familiar waters, latitude sailing became important. Although medieval sailors had no precise way to measure latitude, they understood that the height of the sun at noon, or the height of the North Star at night, changed as you moved north or south. By keeping these celestial bodies at a constant height, you could sail along a constant latitude, essentially following an east-west line. This technique was particularly useful for reaching islands or for crossing the open ocean. But all of these techniques required clear weather. In fog or heavy overcast, when neither sun nor stars were visible, the navigator was essentially blind, reduced to dead reckoning alone and hoping for the best. Many ships ran aground or onto rocks because fog concealed the land until too late. Many made port miles or days from where their navigator expected to be. The margin for error was large, and humility before the difficulty of navigation was a survival trait. What's remarkable is not that medieval navigation was imprecise, but that it worked at all. Year after year, ships crossed open ocean and reached their intended destinations, carried by the skill and knowledge of men who had learned navigation not from books, but from experience, who navigated as their fathers and grandfathers had navigated before them. They knew that finding your way at sea was as much about accepting uncertainty as about calculation, about adapting to what you found rather than insisting on what you expected. And in this acceptance, there was a kind of wisdom that modern precision has perhaps lost. Below the deck, in the dark space that ran the length of the ship, the cargo hold contained both the reason for the voyage and the means of the ship's stability. Understanding what was carried and how it was stowed reveals much about medieval trade and maritime practice, about the economics that drove ships to sea and the practical knowledge that kept them upright when they got there. Wool was perhaps the most common cargo aboard northern European merchant ships, England's primary export to the continent throughout the Middle Ages. Raw wool, shorn from sheep that grazed the English countryside, was packed into huge sacks called wool sacks, each weighing roughly 350 pounds. These wool sacks, made of coarse canvas, were tough enough to withstand rough handling, but permeable enough to let moisture escape. Loading them was back-breaking labour. Men hoisted each sack aboard using rope and block and tackle, then lowered it into the hold where other men dragged it into position. Stowing wool required care. The sacks had to be packed tightly enough to prevent shifting when the ship rolled, but not so tightly that air couldn't circulate. Wool could generate heat as it compressed, heat that in extreme cases could cause spontaneous combustion, setting the entire cargo ablaze. So the crew left spaces between layers, ensuring ventilation, and checked regularly for any sign of heat or smoke. 100 wool sacks might be a typical cargo, representing months of profit if delivered safely, total loss if the ship foundered. Wine travelled in wooden casks, each one carefully made by coopers who specialised in the craft. A wine cask for shipping might hold 50 to 60 gallons, weighing perhaps 500 pounds when full. These casks were rolled aboard and positioned in the hold with their bungs facing up for easy access, then wedged in place with timber to prevent rolling. Wine from Bordeaux, from the Rhine Valley, from Spain and Portugal, all moved north to markets in England, Flanders and the Baltic, carried in holds that smelled of oak and wine, where the slow motion of the sea kept the wine gently agitated throughout the voyage. Grain moved in barrels or sacks, wheat and rye and barley destined for cities that could not feed themselves from local production. Like wool, grain required ventilation to prevent it from heating and spoiling. Unlike wool, grain could shift dramatically if not properly secured, and a cargo of grain that slid to one side could capsize a ship faster than any storm. Experienced sailors placed shifting boards, temporary bulkheads made of planks slotted into place, to divide the cargo into compartments and prevent this catastrophic shifting. But a ship could not always find cargo sufficient to fill her hold and provide adequate ballast. When sailing in ballast without paying cargo or without enough of it, the crew loaded stones or sand into the bilge to weight the ship down, to keep her sitting low enough in the water that wind could not tip her over. These ballast stones came from beaches or quarries, ordinary rocks that served an extraordinary purpose, keeping the ship stable enough to survive the passage to wherever cargo awaited. The arrangement of cargo affected everything about how the ship sailed. Weight too far forward or aft would make her sluggish to steer, slow to respond to the rudder. Weight too high would make her tender, prone to heeling over in wind. Weight too low would make her stiff, rolling violently in waves instead of riding them smoothly. The master and his experienced sailors had to judge these things by feel and by observation, adjusting as necessary by moving cargo within the hold, a task that might take hours of heavy labour but was essential for safe passage. And in the darkness of the hold, among the wool sacks and wine casks, the timber and tar, lived the ship's complement of rats and mice, stowaways that no amount of effort could eliminate. They gnawed at ropes and canvas, contaminated food stores, and occasionally bit sleeping men. Cats were carried to control them, ship's cats that lived semi-wild in the hold, hunting and eating and producing kittens that were distributed to other ships in a continuous effort to maintain some balance between vermin and predator. This too was part of the cargo hold's reality, the living ecology of a wooden ship at sea. Eating aboard a medieval merchant ship was an exercise in survival rather than pleasure, a daily confrontation with monotony, scarcity, and the gradual deterioration of everything edible. The provisioning decisions made before departure determined the crew's health and morale for the entire voyage, yet no matter how carefully the ship was stocked, the quality and variety of food declined with every day at sea. The foundation of the sailor's diet was ship's biscuit, that unleavened bread baked until it was hard as wood, capable of lasting months without spoiling. Making ship's biscuit was a specialised trade. Flour was mixed with water and sometimes salt, shaped into flat rounds or squares, then baked in hot ovens. The biscuit emerged hard and dry, resistant to mould, nearly indestructible. Before eating, sailors would soften the biscuit by soaking it in water or ale, or by crushing it and making a kind of porridge. But even softened, ship's biscuit wore down teeth, and older sailors often had few teeth left, making eating a challenge. Salt meat came next in importance. Beef or pork that had been slaughtered, butchered and packed in barrels of brine months or even years before the voyage. The salt preserved the meat, but also transformed it, making it incredibly salty and tough, requiring prolonged soaking in fresh water before cooking. Even then, salt meat was barely palatable, its texture more like leather than meat, its flavour overwhelming. Sailors learned to tolerate it because the alternative was hunger, but salt meat was food only in the most technical sense. Cheese provided protein and fat, lasting better at sea than fresh meat or fish. Hard cheeses especially could survive months without refrigeration, their waxy rinds protecting the cheese within from mould and decay. Sailors ate cheese with their biscuit, a combination that provided adequate nutrition if not pleasure. As a voyage progressed and cheese supplies dwindled, careful rationing became necessary, with each man receiving his prescribed portion and no more. Peas and beans, dried and stored in sacks, offered variety and nutrition. These could be boiled with salt meat and onions to make pottage, a thick soup or stew that was often the day's main meal. Cooking aboard ship was challenging, limited to days when weather permitted lighting the firebox, a brick-lined container filled with sand in which a small fire could be safely maintained. In rough weather or during storms, hot food was impossible, and the crew ate cold biscuit and cheese. Drinking stale water or whatever ale remained. Ale was the preferred drink aboard ship, safer than water because the brewing process killed harmful organisms. A ship might carry enough ale to last the first weeks of a voyage, precious barrels carefully stowed and rationed. When ale ran out, as it inevitably did, the crew switched to water, drawn from barrels filled before departure. This water, stored in wooden casks in the hold, gradually became stale and brackish, developing algae and slime. Acquiring a taste that required desperation to tolerate, men learned to hold their breath while drinking, to swallow quickly without dwelling on the flavour, to add vinegar or wine dregs if available to mask the worst of the taste. Fresh food was a luxury enjoyed only in the first days after leaving port or when stopping at ports along the way. Onions and garlic, which kept reasonably well, might last a few weeks. Fresh bread from a shoreside bakery would be consumed eagerly in the first day or two. Fresh meat or fish, bought in port, would be eaten immediately, a feast that reminded men what real food tasted like. Some ships carried chickens or other small animals, kept alive to provide fresh eggs or meat, but this was rare on merchant vessels where every bit of space was needed for cargo. As a voyage stretched on, the food situation deteriorated. Weevils infested the ship's biscuit, tiny beetles whose larvae burrowed through the hard bread. Sailors learned to tap their biscuit on the table before eating, shaking out the weevils, or simply ate the weevils along with the bread, grateful for the extra protein. The salt meat's barrels leaked, leaving the meat exposed to air and decay. The cheese developed mould that had to be cut away. The peas and beans, if stored in damp conditions, began to rot. Hunger became a constant companion. a hollow feeling never quite satisfied by the meagre rations. The daily allowance of food was calculated to keep men alive and functioning, not to satisfy appetite or provide pleasure. Men dreamed of food, of fresh bread and roasted meat, of vegetables and fruit, of all the things they couldn't have at sea. These dreams became a kind of torture, especially on long voyages when weeks passed without sight of land, when the same tasteless food appeared day after day after day. Yet somehow men endured. They endured because they had to, because the alternative was starvation. They endured because they knew that eventually, if they survived, the voyage would end and they would eat real food again. They endured because they were sailors, and this was simply part of what sailing meant, part of the price paid for the opportunity to make a living from the sea, and in their endurance, in their ability to keep working despite hunger and poor nutrition, despite the monotony and unpleasantness of their diet, they demonstrated a toughness that modern comfort has largely eliminated from human experience. When night fell at sea, the ship entered a different realm, a world of darkness and strange sounds, of exhausted sleep and watches keeping vigil, of dreams that mixed memory and fear and the constant motion of the sea. Understanding how sailors slept, or tried to sleep, reveals the physical and psychological challenge of life aboard a vessel that never stopped moving, never fell truly silent, never offered real rest. Sleep aboard a medieval merchant ship was always incomplete, always interrupted, always insufficient. There were no dedicated sleeping quarters, no bunks or hammocks in the modern sense. Instead, sailors slept wherever they could find space, on deck under the stars if weather was fair, huddled under the afterdeck's partial shelter if rain threatened, or below deck among the cargo if conditions above were impossible. Each man had his preferred spot, claimed through seniority or force of personality, a piece of deck or hold that became his territory during the voyage. The bedding was minimal. Each sailor carried a woolen cloak that served as blanket and mattress, providing some insulation from the cold wood beneath and the cold air above. Some men had leather bags stuffed with straw or old canvas, crude pillows that might soften the hardness of their resting place. But most simply lay down on the bare deck, wrapped in their cloaks, their heads resting on coiled rope or their own arms. In cold weather, men slept in their clothes, layers of wool and leather that never quite dried, never quite warmed them, but were better than nothing. Darkness at sea was profound in ways difficult for modern people to imagine. There were no electric lights, no ambient glow from cities. On a moonless night, the darkness was absolute, broken only by whatever lanterns the watch kept lit. These lanterns, burning whale oil or tallow, provided small pools of yellow light that barely pushed back the surrounding black. Moving about the deck at night required care, feeling your way from one known point to another, trusting your memory of the ship's layout, accepting that you might trip over rope or stumble into obstacles. Yet in this darkness, if the sky was clear, the stars blazed with intensity never seen from land. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. Planets shone bright enough to cast shadows. On moonlit nights the sea gleamed silver, each wave crest catching light, the whole ocean transformed into something magical and strange. Sailors learned the stars intimately, not just for navigation but for their beauty, for the comfort they provided, for the way they divided the night into familiar patterns. Dreams at sea were often vivid and disturbing, influenced by exhaustion, poor nutrition, stress, and the constant motion. Men dreamed of home, of family and loved ones left behind. They dreamed of food, elaborate feasts that dissolved into disappointment upon waking. They dreamed of drowning, of falling overboard, of the ship breaking apart beneath them. Some claimed to dream of the future, of disasters that would come to pass or fortunes that awaited. These dreams were taken seriously, discussed and analysed, believed to carry meanings or warnings. The watch system structured the night, ensuring that some men always remained alert even when others slept. The watch changed every few hours, The master calling out names, men rousing themselves from sleep to take their turn. The watch had to stay awake and alert, scanning the horizon for other ships or signs of land, listening for changes in wind or weather, ready to wake the entire crew if conditions required. Staying awake on watch was sometimes heroically difficult, especially after days of hard work and little sleep. Men walked back and forth to keep from dozing, or stood at the rail with the cold spray in their faces, or talked quietly with each other, anything to fight the overwhelming desire to sleep. And gradually, imperceptibly, night would fade. The eastern sky would lighten, first to deep blue, then to grey, then to pink and gold. Stars would disappear one by one. The ship and sea would emerge from darkness, colours returning, details becoming visible. Dawn was a moment of transition, of passage from one state to another, and sailors watched it with an appreciation born of having survived another night, of being granted another day. The first light meant that watch was nearly over, that hot food might soon be possible, that the dangers of darkness had passed for now. It was a small comfort, perhaps, but at sea small comforts mattered more than they ever could on land. The storm appeared first as a change in the sky, a darkening to the west, a line of clouds piling higher and higher on the horizon. The wind shifted, becoming fitful, gusting, then falling away, the air taking on a peculiar weight and stillness. Experienced sailors felt it in their bones, that atmospheric pressure that signalled something powerful approaching, something that would test every aspect of the ship and every man aboard her. The first task was preparation, and it had to be completed quickly. The master ordered the sail reefed, reducing its area while there was still time to work safely. Men went aloft, climbing the swaying mast, clinging to wildly moving rigging as they struggled to gather in the heavy wind-filled canvas. The reef points, lines sewn into the sail for this purpose, were tied carefully, securing the gathered canvas so it wouldn't tear free. What remained was a much smaller sail, perhaps a third of the full area, enough to give the ship steerage way but not enough to overpower her. On deck, everything loose had to be secured. Cargo that had shifted slightly during normal sailing was checked and relashed. Equipment was tied down or stowed below. The cook's fire was extinguished and the firebox secured. Hatch covers were placed over the hold's openings and battened down, sealed with tar and canvas to keep water from flooding below. The small boat carried on deck was checked to ensure it wouldn't break loose and become a dangerous projectile sliding across the pitching deck. Then the storm arrived, and preparation gave way to endurance. The wind struck with sudden violence, heeling the ship over, sending spray flying across the deck. The sea built rapidly, waves growing from choppy to large to enormous, their grey-green faces striped with foam. The ship began her battle dance with the waves, climbing each approaching wave's face, rising higher and higher, her bow pointing toward the darkened sky, then cresting the top and plunging down into the trough beyond, burying her bow in the next wave, green water sweeping over the bow and across the deck. Men at the helm fought to keep the ship positioned properly relative to the waves, neither taking them directly on the bow, which might break the mast, nor beam on, which could roll the ship over. The ideal angle was slightly off the bow, letting the ship rise with each wave while maintaining some forward progress. But maintaining this angle required constant attention and tremendous physical strength. The tiller bucked and fought, trying to tear itself from the helmsman's hands. 2 men, sometimes 3, wrestled with it, their muscles straining, their hands bloodied from rope burn and splinters. The worst moment came when a particularly large wave broke over the ship, tons of water crashing down with tremendous force, sweeping across the deck, tearing at everything and everyone. Men clung to whatever they could grasp, ropes or rails or each other, holding on desperately while the water tried to drag them away. Those swept off their feet might be slammed against the mast or gunwale, suffering broken bones or worse. And always there was the fear that the next wave might be even larger, that at any moment the ship might be overwhelmed, rolled over, sent to the bottom with all hands, yet the ship endured. She was built for this, designed by men who understood storms, constructed from oak that could flex and work without breaking, held together by iron and tar and the accumulated knowledge of generations of shipwrights. She took what the storm gave her and survived it, riding up and over waves that seemed impossible to climb, shaking off tons of water, righting herself again and again, her timbers creaking but holding, her hull intact despite the punishment. And finally, gradually, the storm would pass, the wind would ease, the waves would diminish, the sky would lighten. The ship would right herself from her permanent heel, and men would emerge from wherever they had sheltered, looking around with expressions of disbelief that they had survived. The pumps would continue their work, lowering the water in the bilge to manageable levels. Damage would be assessed. Torn sail, parted rigging, lost equipment. Repairs would begin. And the voyage would continue, because that was what sailors did. They continued. They endured. They accepted that storms were simply part of the sea's reality, and that survival meant being stronger than the storm and luckier than your fears. The threat of piracy hung over medieval maritime trade like a constant shadow, a danger that never entirely disappeared even in supposedly peaceful waters. Pirates were not romantic figures in the medieval mind, but rather sea-born bandits. Men who made their living by stealing from merchant ships, and who would kill without hesitation if resistance was offered. Understanding piracy means understanding both the reality of maritime violence and the various strategies merchant ships used to protect themselves and their cargoes. Pirates came in several varieties, each with their own methods and areas of operation. Some were failed merchants themselves. Men who had lost ships or cargoes to bad luck or bad judgment, and who turned to theft as a means of recovery. Others were coastal fishermen who supplemented their uncertain income by occasional piracy when opportunity presented. Still others were organised bands, crews of dedicated criminals who owned fast ships designed specifically for catching and robbing slower merchant vessels. These last were the most dangerous, since they had experience and equipment optimised for violence. The typical pirate attack began with pursuit. Pirates preferred to strike ships that were isolated, separated from convoys or delayed by contrary winds. They used their speed advantage to approach, sometimes showing false colours or signals to get close before revealing their intent. If the merchant ship tried to flee, which most did, the pirates would chase, gradually closing the distance. Waiting for their moment. A merchant cog was not fast, and a pursuer with a favourable wind angle or better sailing qualities would eventually catch up. When the pirate ship came alongside, the crucial moment arrived. Would the merchant crew fight or surrender? The decision rested with the master, who had to weigh several factors rapidly. Fighting meant risk of death or injury to his crew, possible damage to his ship, and likely loss of cargo regardless of the battle's outcome. Surrender meant certain loss of cargo, but possible survival of crew and ship. Most masters chose surrender if the disparity in strength was obvious, reasoning that goods could be replaced but lives could not. If surrender was chosen, the merchant ship would lower her sail in token of submission. The pirates would come aboard, armed with swords and axes, and take command. What happened next depended on the pirate's nature and intentions. More businesslike pirates might simply offload the most valuable cargo, perhaps taking the ship's stores of food and water as well, then leave the merchant crew alive to make port as best they could. Crueler pirates might take everything including the ship itself, forcing the merchant crew into their small boat to row to shore or to die trying. The worst, thankfully rare, would kill the entire crew to eliminate witnesses, leaving the ship adrift and blood-soaked. A ghost ship that might be found days or weeks later. To reduce the risk of piracy, merchants and shipmasters employed several strategies. The most effective was convoy sailing, grouping multiple merchant ships together so they could provide mutual defence. A convoy of 5 or 10 ships, even lightly armed merchant vessels, presented a much more challenging target than a single ship alone. Pirates preferred easy prey, and a convoy was neither easy nor predictable. Some convoys hired armed escort vessels, ships whose only cargo was weapons and fighting men, dedicated to protecting the merchant ships that paid for their service. Individual ships also carried weapons and fighting men when they could afford it. A dozen archers aboard a merchant cog would not defeat a determined pirate attack, but they might make the pirates think twice, might inflict enough casualties that the attack was judged not worth the risk. Crossbows were preferred for maritime combat since they could be used effectively by men without extensive training, and their quarrels could penetrate the light armour pirates typically wore. The economic impact of piracy was substantial. Insurance, such as it existed in medieval times, had to account for the risk of loss to pirates. Freight rates included a premium to cover this risk. Some routes were avoided entirely because piracy was too prevalent, forcing trade to take longer, less direct paths. Cities and kingdoms attempted to suppress piracy through naval patrols and harsh punishments for captured pirates, but the vastness of the sea made complete suppression impossible. For individual sailors, piracy represented a constant source of anxiety. You might complete 50 voyages without encountering pirates, then lose everything on the 51st. The randomness was perhaps the worst aspect, the knowledge that your fate could change in an instant based on nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some sailors became philosophical about it, accepting piracy as another of the sea's many dangers, another risk to be borne stoically. Others lived in constant fear, seeing potential pirates in every distant sail, starting at every unexpected sound. And a few perhaps saw piracy as opportunity rather than threat, considered switching sides, trading the uncertain life of an honest sailor for the even more uncertain but potentially more profitable life of a pirate. The temptation was always there. One more shadow cast by the reality of maritime violence. Illness and injury were constant companions aboard medieval merchant ships, threats that could strike anyone at any time, and that often meant death since treatment options were limited and medical knowledge primitive. The ship carried no professional physician, only perhaps a man designated as surgeon who had some experience with wounds and illness. Though this experience was typically learned through apprenticeship rather than formal education. Understanding medieval maritime medicine means confronting both the vulnerability of human bodies and the remarkable resilience that allowed sailors to survive despite medical care that was, by modern standards, nearly non-existent. Injuries from shipboard accidents were common and often severe. Men working with heavy equipment, rough timbers, and sharp tools in constantly moving environment inevitably got hurt. Rope under strain could part suddenly, its ends whipping back with enough force to break bones or tear flesh. Heavy blocks and pulleys could fall from aloft, striking men on the head or shoulders. The ship's violent motion in rough weather threw men against hard surfaces, causing bruises, cuts, broken bones and concussions. Fingers were crushed when caught between cargo and hull. Toes were broken by dropped equipment. And the constant wetness meant that small cuts became infected, simple scrapes turning into serious wounds. The designated surgeon, when one was aboard, had limited tools and knowledge to address these injuries. For cuts and wounds, the treatment was cleaning with salt water or wine, then bandaging with whatever clean cloth was available. Deep wounds might be cauterized with hot iron to stop bleeding, a procedure so painful that men had to be held down while it was performed. Broken bones might be set if the break was simple, splintered with wooden pieces bound in place with cloth strips. But complex fractures, compound breaks where bone-pierced skin, usually meant death from infection or shock. Disease was even more dangerous than injury because it could spread through the crew, turning one sick man into 10 or 20. Gastrointestinal illness from contaminated food or water was common, causing vomiting and diarrhea that could debilitate a man within hours. In the confined space of a ship with limited hygiene facilities and no understanding of germ theory, such illnesses spread easily. Men would become weak, unable to work, requiring care from their already overburdened shipmates. Scurvy, though not yet understood in medieval times, was perhaps the most feared disease of long voyages. After weeks or months at sea without fresh food, men's gums would begin to bleed, their teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would reopen, bruises would appear spontaneously, strength would drain away, replaced by overwhelming fatigue. Men with advanced scurvy might die from seemingly minor complications, their bodies no longer able to heal or resist infection. The cause, vitamin C deficiency, would not be understood for centuries. But sailors knew empirically that fresh food prevented the condition. The problem was that fresh food was unavailable on long voyages, making scurvy an accepted if dreaded consequence of extended time at sea. Fever was both symptom and diagnosis, a general term for any illness that raised body temperature and caused delirium. Treatment options were limited: cooling the patient with wet cloths, forcing fluids, prayer. Sometimes fever broke on its own and the patient recovered. Often it didn't. And death came after days of suffering, the sick man raving in delirium while his shipmates worked around him, unable to help, trying not to imagine themselves in his place. Prevention was more valued than treatment, since treatment options were so limited. Sailors learned to be careful, to move deliberately rather than hastily, to maintain 3 points of contact when moving about the ship. They learned to check equipment before using it, to inspect rope for weak spots, to avoid working under men working aloft. They learned to eat whatever food was available, even if unappetizing, knowing that nutrition maintained strength and health. They learned basic hygiene, washing hands in seawater when possible, keeping wounds as clean as conditions allowed. And when prevention failed, when injury or illness struck despite all precautions, sailors relied on each other. Shipmates cared for the sick, bringing them water, helping them to the rail when they needed to vomit or relieve themselves, sitting with them through the night when fever raged. This mutual care was not based on medical knowledge, but on simple human compassion, on the recognition that today's caregiver might be tomorrow's patient, that at sea everyone was vulnerable and everyone needed others to survive. In this mutual dependence, in this willingness to care for each other despite the risk of contagion and the limited hope of success, sailors created a form of community that transcended the usual boundaries of medieval society. Though the term captain had not yet come into standard use for merchant shipmasters, the master's authority aboard ship rested on a complex foundation of maritime law, custom, and practical necessity. Understanding the legal framework that governed medieval ships and seamen reveals a sophisticated system of rights and obligations, of written and unwritten rules that attempted to bring order to the inherently chaotic environment of sea travel. The master's rudder served partly as a logbook, though not in the modern sense of daily entries recording position and events. Instead, it was a more occasional document, noting significant occurrences: when cargo was loaded and offloaded, when major repairs were made, when crew members joined or left the ship. These entries served as evidence in case of disputes, providing documentary support for the master's version of events. In an age when many sailors were illiterate, the master's ability to read and write gave him additional authority, his written words carrying weight that mere memory could not match. Maritime law itself was a patchwork of local customs and broader traditions, varying from port to port but sharing common themes across northern Europe. One fundamental principle was that the master's authority, though extensive at sea, was not absolute. Certain decisions required consultation with the crew. For instance, if the master wanted to make for a port other than the originally agreed destination, he typically needed crew consent. If the ship encountered severe danger and the master proposed abandoning her, the crew had to agree to this course of action. But this system also meant that disputes over profit and payment were common. When a voyage ended, the master had to calculate profits after expenses, then divide what remained according to the agreed shares. Crew members who felt cheated could bring complaints to port authorities, who would hear both sides and render judgment. These admiralty courts, as they came to be called, developed sophisticated procedures for resolving maritime disputes, creating precedents that would influence maritime law for centuries. Cargo disputes were even more complex. If cargo was damaged or lost during the voyage, who bore the loss? Generally, the rule was that loss from, quote, one storms, unavoidable accidents, quote, fell on the cargo owner, while loss from the master's negligence or misconduct fell on the master. But distinguishing between unavoidable accident and negligence was difficult, often requiring testimony from crew members and other maritime experts. Some port cities developed detailed written codes spelling out these responsibilities, but much remained subject to interpretation. Piracy and capture created special legal problems. If a ship was taken by pirates, who owned any cargo that was recovered? If the ship itself was recaptured from pirates, did ownership revert to the original owner, or did it belong to the recapturers as prize? If the master ransomed the ship by promising payment to pirates, was he obligated to honour that promise? These questions had different answers in different jurisdictions, and merchants and masters had to navigate this legal complexity as carefully as they navigated physical waters. The right of jettison, throwing cargo overboard to save the ship during a storm, was recognised but strictly regulated. The master could order jettison only in genuine emergency, and the loss was supposed to be distributed proportionally among all cargo owners rather than falling entirely on those whose goods were thrown overboard. This rule of general average, as it came to be called, required careful record-keeping and often led to lengthy legal proceedings after the voyage to determine each party's share of the loss. Crew discipline was another area where law and custom intersected. The master could punish minor offences like laziness or drunkenness with extra work assignments or reduced rations. More serious offences like theft or violence required more substantial punishment. But there were limits to what the master could do without formal legal process. He could confine a dangerous crew member, could put him ashore at the next port, could certainly refuse to hire him again. But torture or execution required involvement of port authorities, except in the most extreme circumstances like mutiny. Salvage law governed what happened when sailors found abandoned ships or cargo floating at sea. Generally, the rule was, quote, 3, with the salvagers entitled to keep what they recovered or to claim substantial compensation from the original owners. This created incentive to rescue ships and cargo that might otherwise be lost, but it also created temptation to declare a ship abandoned prematurely or even to cause abandonment deliberately. Accusations of false salvage claims were common, requiring adjudication by port authorities who had to balance encouraging legitimate salvage against preventing maritime theft. All of these legal frameworks attempted to impose order and predictability on maritime commerce, to provide rules that would be followed even at sea where no authority could enforce them immediately. The system worked imperfectly, subject to the limitations of the age and the temptations that isolated authority always creates. But it worked well enough that trade continued, that ships sailed, that merchants entrusted valuable cargo to vessels that would be beyond reach of law for weeks or months. And in that trust, however qualified, lay the foundation of medieval maritime commerce. Sighting land after days or weeks at sea was a moment of profound emotion. A transition from the uncertainty and danger of the ocean to the relative safety and certainty of the coast. The first sign might be birds flying in from shore, or a change in wave patterns as depth decreased, or a smudge on the horizon that gradually resolved itself into the shape of land. Whatever the first indication, it triggered a change in the crew's mood, a lifting of spirits, a renewal of energy even among exhausted men. Approaching an unfamiliar port required caution. Coastal waters were often more dangerous than the open sea, full of rocks and shoals, with tides and currents that could drive a ship onto hazards before the crew realised danger. The master studied his rudder carefully, comparing what he saw to the descriptions written there. He might send a boat ahead to sound the depth, checking for underwater obstacles. He certainly watched for local fishing boats or pilot vessels, boats whose crews knew these waters intimately and could guide the merchant ships safely to anchorage. Pilots were both essential and expensive, local sailors who made their living guiding foreign ships into port. They came aboard knowing the position of every rock and sandbar, the set of every current, the direction of every tide. They took the helm and directed the ship, their local knowledge preventing disasters that would otherwise be inevitable. Masters had to trust these pilots despite knowing nothing about them, had to surrender control of their ships to strangers, and hope that the pilots were competent and honest. Most were, since reputation was everything in the pilot trade, but occasional instances of pilot incompetence or malice reminded masters that trust was always a gamble. The actual harbour might be a natural bay protected from ocean swells, or it might be an artificial creation, a basin dug from marshland and protected by breakwaters. Either way, it provided shelter from weather and a place to load and offload cargo safely. Some harbours were enormous, capable of hosting hundreds of ships at once. Others were tiny, able to accommodate only a handful of vessels, forcing late arrivals to anchor in the roadstead outside and wait for space within. Anchoring itself was a skilled operation. The master selected a spot with adequate depth, good holding ground for the anchor, and sufficient room so that when the ship swung with tide and wind she wouldn't collide with other vessels. The anchor, a massive piece of iron with flukes designed to dig into the sea bottom, was lowered on its cable until it reached the bottom. Then additional cable was paid out to ensure the anchor set properly. The ship came to rest, still moving slightly with wind and current but no longer travelling. Stationary at last after days or weeks in motion. Once anchored, harbour officials would come aboard to inspect cargo and collect duties. These officials had authority to question the master about where he had sailed from, what he carried, whether any disease had appeared during the voyage. Certain cargoes required special documentation or payment of special taxes. The master had to navigate this bureaucracy carefully, providing the information required but not volunteering anything that might increase his tax burden or create regulatory problems. Offloading cargo was hard labour accomplished by stevedores, professional dock workers who boarded the ship and transferred goods to small boats that ferried them to shore. The ship's crew helped, but did not usually do the bulk of the work themselves. Instead, they began the process of ship maintenance, repairing damage sustained during the voyage, replacing worn rigging, caulking seams that had opened, scraping away growth from the underwater hull if the ship was to remain in port long enough for the tide to expose it. For the crew, reaching port meant several things simultaneously. It meant rest from the constant vigilance and labour of sea travel. It meant hot food, fresh water, and the possibility of sleeping on something that wasn't moving. It meant reconnection with civilization after isolation, the chance to hear news, to visit taverns and brothels, to spend what little money they had earned. But it also meant the crew's close-knit unity would temporarily dissolve, each man going his own way, the community that had sustained them at sea fragmenting as soon as they stepped ashore. Payment of shares came after the cargo was sold and the master had calculated profit and expenses. This might take days or even weeks, during which the crew waited with varying degrees of patience. Some masters were scrupulous about payment, settling accounts quickly and fairly. Others found excuses to delay or to reduce shares, claiming unexpected expenses or damage to cargo that reduced profits. Disputes were common, sometimes ending in Admiralty Court, sometimes settled through informal negotiation or threat of violence, sometimes simply accepted by sailors who lacked resources to challenge masters formally. For the master, arrival in port brought different stresses. He had to account for any loss or damage to cargo, had to settle with merchants and cargo owners, had to arrange for sale of goods if he was trading on his own account. He had to pay harbour fees, crew shares, pilot fees, and countless other expenses. He had to begin planning the next voyage, finding new cargo to carry, recruiting crew to replace those who wouldn't sail again with him. The end of one voyage was merely prelude to the beginning of another, a cycle that would continue as long as the ship remained seaworthy and demand for transport remained. Yet despite all these concerns and complications, reaching home port held special meaning. For men whose home was the same as the ship's home port, arrival meant reunion with family. With wives and children, parents and friends. It meant stepping back into a life temporarily suspended by the voyage, reclaiming identity as father or son or husband that had been subsumed into identity as sailor. Letters waited, news had accumulated, life had continued in their absence, and now they returned to it. But the return was always strange, always slightly disorienting. The land felt too still after weeks at sea. Solid ground seemed to move beneath their feet for days, an illusion created by bodies accustomed to constant motion. The concerns of people ashore seemed trivial compared to the life and death matters they had navigated at sea. They had been changed by the voyage in ways they couldn't fully articulate, and they returned to a place that was familiar yet somehow foreign. This too was part of the sailor's life, the constant oscillation between sea and land, between one identity and another, between the close community of the ship and the broader but less intimate community ashore. And in time, whether it took weeks or days, the call would come again. The ship was ready. New cargo awaited. The tide and wind were favourable. And the cycle would begin once more, the ancient rhythm of departure and return that had defined maritime life since humans first ventured onto the water. The medieval sailor lived in a world saturated with religious meaning and supernatural danger, where the boundary between natural and divine was porous, and where survival often seemed to depend as much on divine favour as on human skill. Understanding the religious and superstitious beliefs of medieval mariners reveals not irrationality, but rather a coherent attempt to make sense of forces that were, by any practical measure, beyond human control or full understanding. Every voyage began with prayer. Before casting off, the crew would gather for a blessing from a priest if one was available, or the master might lead prayers himself. The most common invocation was to St. Nicholas, patron saint of sailors, whose intercession was sought for safe passage. But other saints had their devotees as well. St. Christopher for travellers, St. Clement for safe harbours, the Virgin Mary for protection against all dangers. These prayers were not mere formality but genuine appeals for help, spoken by men who knew that their lives might soon depend on forces they could not predict or resist. Certain words were forbidden aboard ship. Whistling was believed to summon wind, acceptable in calm but dangerous during a storm. Mentioning clergy by their titles invited bad luck. Starting a voyage on Friday was avoided when possible, as was sailing during certain phases of the moon. Women aboard ship were sometimes considered unlucky, though this belief was inconsistent and often ignored in practice. Black cats might be good luck or bad depending on local tradition. Seeing porpoises alongside the ship was considered a good omen, as was seeing dolphins, while sharks following the ship was ominous. Death aboard ship created special anxieties. The body could not simply be kept until reaching port, since decomposition in warm weather would make this impossible and unsanitary. Instead, the dead were buried at sea, sewn into canvas weighted with rocks or old chain, committed to the deep with prayers for their souls. But this sea burial, necessary though it was, troubled many sailors. Where was the body's resurrection to occur if it rested in the ocean rather than in consecrated ground? Would the fish-eaten remains rise whole on Judgment Day? Priests offered reassurances about God's power to restore the body regardless of its condition, but doubt remained. The sea itself was sometimes personified, treated as a conscious entity with moods and preferences. Offerings might be thrown overboard to appease it. Coins, food, even wine if wine was available. These offerings had no Christian justification but were made anyway, remnants of much older traditions in which the sea was a god or goddess who required propitiation. The Church officially disapproved of such practices, categorizing them as pagan superstition, but enforcement was impossible at sea, and many sailors saw no contradiction between Christian prayer and older forms of maritime propitiation. Dreams at sea were taken as prophetic, carrying messages or warnings that required interpretation. A dream of drowning might foretell disaster, or it might be the soul's preparation for death, or it might mean nothing at all. A dream of home and family might indicate the voyage was nearing its end, or it might be mere wishful thinking. Sailors would discuss their dreams with each other, comparing interpretations, looking for patterns or recurring symbols. Some kept silent about disturbing dreams, fearing that speaking them aloud might make them real. Ghost ships and sea monsters occupied a space between superstition and genuine sighting. Many sailors claimed to have seen vessels sailing under impossible conditions, ships without crew moving against the wind, or phantom ships that disappeared when approached. Were these visions real, hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and stress, or embellished stories that grew in the telling? Sailors themselves were often uncertain, describing what they saw while acknowledging they couldn't fully explain it. Sea monsters similarly inhabited this uncertain space. Large fish seen briefly might become dragons in the telling, or encounters with whales unfamiliar to northern waters might be interpreted as monsters unknown to science. What all these beliefs shared, whether officially Christian or anciently pagan, was the recognition that humans at sea were small and vulnerable, that survival required not just skill and effort, but also favour from powers beyond human control. Whether those powers were conceived as the Christian God and his saints, as the personified sea itself, or as more nebulous forces of fate and fortune, the essential truth remained. At sea, human power had limits, and acknowledging those limits through prayer, superstition and ritual was not weakness but wisdom. Language aboard a medieval merchant ship was a more complex matter than might be immediately apparent. A shifting mix of native tongues, specialised maritime vocabulary, and the practical pidgins that developed when men from different linguistic backgrounds needed to work together. Understanding how sailors communicated reveals both the internationalism of medieval trade and the barriers that this linguistic diversity created. Most ships sailing northern European waters would have crews drawn primarily from a single linguistic region. An English ship would have an English crew speaking various dialects of Middle English. A ship from the Hanseatic cities would have a Low German crew. A vessel from Normandy would carry French-speaking sailors. Within these linguistic groups, communication was straightforward enough, though dialect differences could be substantial. A man from London might struggle to understand a sailor from Cornwall, just as a Lübecker might find a Danziger's German strange to his ear. But medieval maritime trade was already international, and ships frequently carried mixed crews, especially on longer voyages where crews might be supplemented with men hired in foreign ports. When an English master needed to communicate with a German sailor, or when a mixed crew of English, Flemish and Norman men needed to work together, language became a practical problem requiring practical solutions. Numbers were crucial for navigation and cargo management, and most sailors learned to count in multiple languages. Being able to understand and communicate basic numbers meant you could comprehend measurements, quantities, depths, and times regardless of what language the speaker used. Similarly, basic commands like quote 4, quote 5, quote 6, quote 7 were among the first vocabulary any foreign sailor learned when joining a ship with a different linguistic background. Weather terms were another area where multilingual competence developed quickly. Understanding words for wind, rain, storm, calm, and their various gradations could mean the difference between proper response and dangerous confusion. An English sailor working on a German ship would prioritise learning weather vocabulary, just as a French sailor on an English vessel would make sure he understood the terms his English shipmates used to describe changing conditions. But language barriers could still create serious problems, especially in emergencies where quick communication and mutual understanding were essential. A critical order misunderstood or not understood at all could lead to injury or disaster. Masters of ships with mixed crews had to be aware of these limitations, had to ensure that crucial orders were understood even if this required repetition, demonstration, or having another crew member translate. Written language aboard ship was usually limited to the master and perhaps one or two other men who were literate. The rudder was written in whatever language the master used, typically the language of the ship's home port. Bills of lading, cargo manifests, and other commercial documents might be in Latin, the international language of medieval commerce, or in the language of whatever port the document originated from. Merchants and ship owners had to navigate this multilingual documentary reality, sometimes hiring scribes or translators to help them understand documents in unfamiliar languages. Songs and stories were language-specific, part of what bound sailors from the same linguistic background together. An English crew might sing work songs in English while hauling rope or raising anchor, the rhythm of the song coordinating their efforts. These songs would be incomprehensible to foreign sailors, creating a cultural boundary even as men worked side by side. Similarly, the stories sailors told during idle hours, the jokes they shared, the curses they employed when frustrated, all remained embedded in native languages, creating islands of exclusive communication within the ship's multilingual community. Sailors who sailed regularly to the same foreign ports often developed substantial competence in the local language. An English sailor making regular voyages to Bordeaux would learn French, at least the practical marketplace French needed for dealing with merchants, innkeepers, and prostitutes. Similarly, a Hanseatic sailor who frequently visited London would develop working knowledge of English. This individual multilingualism, built up through repeated exposure rather than formal study, created a class of cosmopolitan sailors who served as informal translators and cultural bridges between different maritime communities. The result was a linguistic environment that was both fragmented and surprisingly functional. Men spoke different native languages, but shared enough specialized vocabulary and gestural communication to work together effectively. They created simplified pidgins when necessary, and developed individual multilingual competence over time. They struggled with language barriers, but rarely let these barriers prevent them from accomplishing their work, and in doing so they created a maritime culture that transcended linguistic boundaries, a community defined not by shared language, but by shared experience, shared skills, and shared understanding of the sea's demands and dangers. The connection between a sailor and his ship was unlike any other relationship in medieval life, a bond formed through intimate knowledge and mutual dependence, through months or years of shared experience in which the ship's survival meant the sailor's survival, and vice versa. Understanding this relationship requires moving beyond thinking of the ship as mere tool or property, and recognizing how sailors came to view their vessels as living entities with distinct personalities and fates. A sailor who served aboard the same ship for multiple voyages came to know her with extraordinary intimacy. He knew how she responded to the helm under different conditions, knew whether she answered quickly or sluggishly, whether she tended to fall off the wind or to come up into it. He knew how she moved through waves, whether she was a wet ship that took water over the bow even in moderate seas, or a dry ship that rode up and over cleanly. He knew her sounds, which creaks and groans were normal and which might indicate something amiss. The relationship between ship and crew was complicated by the fact that most ships outlasted individual sailors. A ship might sail for 30 or 40 years if well maintained, while few sailors remained aboard the same vessel for more than a fraction of that time. Crews changed gradually, old sailors retiring or dying, new sailors joining. The ship thus provided continuity, linking successive generations of sailors, carrying accumulated knowledge and tradition from one crew to the next. An old ship had history, stories of past voyages and past crews, memories embedded in her very timbers. Merchant ships were typically not large enough or valuable enough to be given elaborate figureheads in the medieval period, unlike warships which might carry carved figures on bow or stern. But even without such decoration, ships had visual character. The pattern of wear on the deck, the patches in the sail, the particular colour that tar and salt and sun had given the timbers, all made each ship distinctive. Sailors could often identify ships at a distance simply from their appearance. recognizing individual vessels as they might recognize human faces. When a ship was lost, whether to storm or rocks or any of the sea's many hazards, survivors grieved not just for lost shipmates, but for the ship herself. They spoke of her as they might speak of a deceased companion, recounting her qualities and past achievements, lamenting that she was gone. This grief was genuine, not performed or exaggerated, arising from the severing of a relationship that had been central to their lives and identities. New ships, conversely, were approached with caution and curiosity. A ship's first voyage was considered particularly important, establishing her character and luck. A successful maiden voyage was a good sign, suggesting the ship would serve well. A difficult or disaster-plagued first voyage raised doubts about whether the ship was cursed or unlucky, whether she would ever sail reliably. Sailors preferred serving aboard proven ships with good reputations over taking chances aboard untested vessels. The physical act of maintaining the ship created and reinforced the bond between sailors and vessel. Hundreds of hours spent caulking seams, tarring rigging, splicing rope, replacing worn planks. All this labour made the ship partly the crew's creation, something they had worked to sustain and improve. Each repair was a gift given to the ship, an investment in her continued existence and function. In return, the ship gave them the means of livelihood, carried them safely across dangerous waters, provided the floating home that was the centre of their working lives. This relationship between sailors and ships may seem strange from a modern perspective, accustomed to viewing objects as mere objects, as things to be used and discarded without emotional attachment. But medieval sailors had no such detachment. Their lives depended too completely on their ships. They spent too much time aboard. They worked too hard maintaining and preserving the vessel for the relationship to remain merely instrumental. The ship was not just a tool but a partner, not just property but companion, not just workplace but home. And understanding this changes how we think about medieval maritime life, revealing emotional depth and relational complexity that simple economic or technical histories miss entirely. To stand at the rail of a medieval merchant ship gazing out at the horizon was to confront fundamental questions about the nature of the world and humanity's place within it. The horizon, that perfectly circular boundary between sea and sky, marked both a physical limit and a philosophical threshold, a line that could be approached but never reached, always the same distance away no matter how far the ship travelled. Understanding what this horizon meant to medieval sailors requires exploring both the cosmology they inherited and the practical knowledge they accumulated through experience. The educated medieval worldview held that Earth was spherical, a truth known since classical antiquity, though often misunderstood by those without access to formal education. Sailors, even illiterate ones, generally understood Earth's roundness through practical observation. They saw ships disappear hull first over the horizon, their masts visible long after their decks had vanished below the Earth's curve. They noticed that the North Star's height above the horizon changed as they sailed north or south, exactly as it should if Earth were a sphere. These observations required no complex mathematics or abstract reasoning, just careful attention to what was actually visible. Yet this spherical Earth was small by modern standards, and limited by what humans could actually explore. The medieval sailor knew of 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. He might have heard vague rumours of lands beyond the Western Ocean, but these were just stories, tales told in taverns, not practical knowledge that affected navigation or trade. The habitable world, as he understood it, was bounded by ocean to the west, by desert and mountains to the south and east, by frozen seas to the north. Within these boundaries lay the known world, the space that humans could meaningfully interact with. The ocean itself was conceived differently than modern oceanography understands it. Medieval sources sometimes spoke of different oceans or seas as if they were separate entities rather than parts of one continuous body of water. The Mediterranean was its own sea, distinct from the Atlantic. The Baltic was separate from the North Sea despite their obvious connection. This conceptual fragmentation reflected practical reality. These bodies of water had different characteristics, different hazards, different patterns of trade and travel. From a sailor's perspective, they functioned as separate spaces even though theoretically they were all part of the same global ocean. Depth was another frontier, one even more mysterious than geographical extent. Sailors could measure depth in coastal waters using their lead lines, but in the deep ocean, no line was long enough to reach bottom. The ocean's depth was therefore unknown and perhaps unknowable, a vertical extension of the world that could only be wondered about. Stories circulated of sea monsters dwelling in these depths, of underwater mountains and valleys, of strange currents that flowed along the bottom. None of this could be verified, but all of it had a certain plausibility given how little was actually known about what existed below the surface. The horizon's distance provided a practical limit to vision and therefore to knowledge. On a clear day from a ship's deck, a sailor could see perhaps 3 or 4 leagues in any direction before the Earth's curve made objects invisible. This meant that at any given moment, even in the middle of the ocean, the sailor existed in a bubble of visibility perhaps 7 or 8 leagues across, beyond which everything was hidden. Ships, land, storms, dangers, all remained invisible until the ship entered this bubble of awareness. The world thus revealed itself gradually as the ship moved, never more than a small piece visible at once. This limited visibility created unique psychological effects. The ship existed in a kind of moving present, always surrounded by visible sea and sky, but with no connection to what lay beyond the horizon. Past and future were equally invisible, existing only in memory and anticipation. This enforced presence, this inability to see beyond the immediate, could be either peaceful or claustrophobic depending on the sailor's temperament and circumstances. Some men found it liberating, a freedom from concerns about distant things. Others found it oppressive, a constant reminder of isolation and vulnerability. The stars at night provided a different kind of horizon, a vertical rather than horizontal boundary. The celestial sphere seemed to rotate around Earth, stars rising in the east and setting in the west, their paths across the sky perfectly predictable. Sailors used this celestial motion for navigation, but also contemplated it philosophically. What caused the stars to move? What were they? How far away were they? Medieval astronomy provided answers to these questions, placing stars on a rotating sphere at a fixed distance from Earth. But sailors had their own observations and intuitions that didn't always align with learned theory. Meteors, falling stars, were interpreted variously as signs or omens, as souls departing the world, or simply as natural phenomena whose cause remained mysterious. Comets were more obviously significant, appearing rarely and unpredictably, their tails streaming across the sky in apparent defiance of the regular motions of other celestial bodies. These were almost universally interpreted as portents, warnings of important events to come, though what exactly they portended remained subject to interpretation. The aurora borealis, occasionally visible at northern latitudes, was among the most mysterious phenomena sailors witnessed. Medieval sources sometimes called these lights the aurora polaris, northern lights, and attributed them to various causes. Some thought they were reflections of distant fires. Others believed them to be armies of spirits fighting in the sky. Sailors who witnessed auroras told of curtains of green and red light, of shimmering and dancing illumination that covered half the sky, of displays so bright that the deck was lit as if by moonlight. These experiences were difficult to communicate to those who hadn't witnessed them, contributing to the sense that the far north was a place of wonder and mystery. All of these observations and speculations came together in the sailor's understanding of his place in the cosmos. He existed on a small world surrounded by vast ocean, beneath a sky of stars whose nature and distance remained mysterious, participating in trade and travel that connected distant places, but never escaping the limitations imposed by human scale and human senses. This worldview was simultaneously humble and ambitious. Humble in acknowledging how small the known world was and how much remained mysterious. Ambitious in continuing to venture out onto dangerous waters to explore and connect what could be explored and connected. And standing at that rail, looking out at the horizon, the medieval sailor carried this worldview with him. This understanding that he was both small in the cosmic scheme and yet significant enough that his voyages mattered, that the work he did connecting distant ports contributed to something larger than himself. What made a man keep returning to the sea, voyage after voyage, year after year, despite the hardships and dangers, despite the poor food and uncertain pay, despite the knowledge that many sailors never made it home? Understanding why men became sailors and why they remained sailors requires looking beyond economics to questions of identity, community and meaning, to the complex mix of practical necessity and something deeper that kept maritime culture alive across generations. Some men became sailors because they had no choice, born into coastal communities where fishing and maritime trade were the only realistic ways to make a living. From childhood they grew up around boats and ships, learning maritime skills as naturally as inland children learned agriculture. By the time they were old enough to choose a profession, if choice was even available to them, they were already sailors in training, already committed to a maritime life by circumstance and accumulated knowledge. For these men, sailing was not a choice made, but a destiny inherited. Others came to the sea by more active choice, drawn by the prospect of adventure or profit, by the desire to escape poverty or obligation, by romantic notions of maritime life that rarely matched the reality. Young men from inland communities might make their way to ports, seeking employment aboard ships, imagining a life of freedom and exploration. Most discovered quickly that reality was far harder than imagination, but by then they had invested time and effort in learning the trade, had formed connections with other sailors, had begun the process of transformation from landsman to seaman. The transformation itself was profound. Learning to live and work at sea required developing new senses and skills, new ways of perceiving and responding to the environment. A successful sailor became attuned to wind and wave in ways that were difficult to articulate but essential for survival. He learned to read subtle signs that indicated changing weather, to feel through the ship's motion what was happening below and around him, to work effectively despite constant motion and inadequate sleep. These skills, once learned, marked him as a sailor, gave him identity and status within maritime communities. This identity carried with it both pride and stigma. Within maritime communities, experienced sailors were respected for their skills and knowledge, given social status that might exceed their economic position. A master mariner might be one of the most important men in a port town despite not being wealthy, his expertise and reputation giving him influence and authority. Common sailors had less prestige but still participated in the status that came from doing skilled, dangerous work that others could not or would not do. But outside maritime communities, sailors were often viewed with suspicion or contempt. Their transient lifestyle, their long absences, their tendency to spend money quickly when in port, all marked them as somehow unreliable or disreputable. The rough manners and profane language common among sailors scandalised respectable society. Women, particularly women of good family, were warned to avoid sailors, who were seen as unsuitable marriage partners due to their uncertain livelihood and long absences. This social stigma meant that sailors often lived somewhat apart, forming their own communities within port towns, marrying within those communities, creating networks of mutual support that existed parallel to mainstream society. The bonds formed between sailors were unusually strong, forged through shared danger and isolation. Men who had survived storms together, who had worked side by side for months at sea, developed friendships that often lasted lifetimes. These friendships transcended the usual social boundaries of medieval society. Sailors might be friends despite coming from different regions, speaking different languages, holding different social ranks ashore. At sea, what mattered was competence and reliability, and these qualities created connections that persisted when men returned to land. Some sailors formed permanent partnerships, 2 or 3 men who always sailed together, who hired onto ships as a unit, whose skills complemented each other. These partnerships might last decades, ending only with retirement or death. The partners knew each other's strengths and weaknesses intimately, anticipated each other's actions, worked together with an efficiency that solitary sailors could never match. For many sailors, the ship and crew became more real, more important, than whatever family or community they had ashore. Months at sea created bonds stronger than the attenuated connections to people who were absent and increasingly distant. Some sailors never married, or married but maintained only loose connections to wives and children, finding their primary emotional and social satisfaction in maritime community rather than in family life. This was both cause and effect of the maritime lifestyle. Men without strong family ties were more willing to sail for months at a time, while months of absence weakened family ties that might have been stronger with more consistent presence. Yet other sailors managed to maintain strong connections to family while pursuing maritime careers. They sailed for a few months, returned home for weeks or months, then sailed again, creating a rhythm of absence and presence that their families adapted to. Children grew up seeing their fathers intermittently, learning to accept absence as normal, measuring time by voyages. Wives learned to manage households and finances independently, to make decisions without husbands' input, to live in a state of permanent uncertainty about whether their husbands would return from each voyage. The reasons men kept returning to sea, despite everything, were complex and varied. Some continued because they knew no other trade, because maritime skills were not transferable to shore occupations. Others returned because they genuinely loved the sea, because they found something in maritime life that satisfied them in ways that life ashore never could. Still others sailed from simple economic necessity, because they needed the income, however irregular and uncertain it might be. But perhaps the deepest reason was that prolonged time at sea changed people in ways that made them unfit for ordinary life ashore. After months of living in a small wooden world, of constant motion, of horizons unobstructed by buildings or hills, of close community with shipmates who understood without explanation what you had experienced, returning to land could feel claustrophobic and isolating. The land was too still, the spaces too enclosed, the conversations too superficial. People who hadn't been to sea couldn't understand, and explaining was impossible because the experience was too far outside normal reference points. So sailors returned to sea again and again because that was where they belonged, where they made sense, where their skills and knowledge had value and purpose. They returned because the sea, for all its dangers and hardships, offered something that life ashore did not: a clarity of purpose, an intensity of experience, a community of shared understanding. They returned because somewhere along the way, through process gradual and irreversible, they had ceased to be landsmen who temporarily went to sea and had become sailors for whom time ashore was merely interlude between voyages. The salt had entered their blood, as sailors said, and once there it never entirely left, calling them back to the water, to the horizon, to the life that had claimed them. There existed aboard medieval merchant ships a class of sailors who had survived decades at sea, men in their 40s or 50s or even older, whose faces were carved with years of sun and salt, whose hands bore the scars of countless ropes and timbers, whose eyes held the particular quality of those who had seen much and judged wisely what they saw. These veterans were not usually masters, not men who gave orders or made decisions, but their presence shaped voyages in ways both subtle and profound, their accumulated knowledge making the difference between competent sailing and exceptional sailing, between adequate response to crisis and optimal response. These experienced sailors possessed what might be called tacit knowledge, understanding that existed not in explicit rules or verbal instruction, but in practiced judgment developed through years of observation. A young sailor might learn that certain cloud formations indicated coming storms, but the veteran knew which storms and how soon, and how severe. A novice might understand that ships handle differently in different sea states, but the experienced hand felt through the tiller or the sheet exactly how this particular ship would respond to this particular combination of wind and wave, adjusting without conscious thought in ways that kept the vessel safe and efficient. This knowledge was difficult to transmit formally because it was so deeply embedded in experience. The veteran couldn't always explain why he did things certain ways, or why he recommended particular courses of action. He simply knew, the way a skilled craftsman knows through feel when an object is properly shaped or balanced. Young sailors learned from these veterans not through instruction but through imitation and observation, watching how the experienced men worked, trying to replicate their techniques, gradually developing similar instincts through their own accumulating experience. The social position of these veterans was interesting and complex. They were respected by the crew, their opinions sought on matters technical and practical, their approval valued by younger sailors trying to master the craft. Yet they held no formal authority, took orders like any common sailor, received payment based on shares rather than special compensation for their knowledge. Some masters valued such men highly, listening carefully to their counsel, creating space for their influence without formally acknowledging it. Other masters, particularly young or insecure ones, resented the veterans' expertise and authority, feeling threatened by the respect these older sailors commanded from the crew. Physically, these veterans bore the marks of their profession in ways both visible and invisible. Their hands were thick and calloused, fingers sometimes permanently curved from gripping rope, joints swollen from injury and arthritis. Their backs bore the strain of decades of heavy lifting and awkward postures. Their hearing was often damaged from years of wind and wave noise. Their teeth, if they had any left, were worn down from ship's biscuit and poor nutrition. Yet they continued working because they had no retirement, no pension, no means of support except continued labour. Some of these older sailors had achieved a kind of peace with maritime life, had stopped struggling against its hardships and simply accepted them as the unchangeable conditions of existence. They no longer complained about cold or wet, about poor food or inadequate sleep. They had learned to find satisfaction in smaller things, a well-executed manoeuvre, a difficult passage navigated successfully, the respect of younger sailors, the simple fact of having survived another voyage. This acceptance was not resignation, but rather hard-won wisdom, understanding that some things could be changed through effort, while others had to be endured with grace. Others became more bitter with age, accumulating grievances against masters who had cheated them, against merchants who had been ungrateful, against the whole system of maritime commerce that demanded so much and gave so little back. These bitter veterans were difficult crew members, their constant complaints and cynicism affecting morale. Yet even they possessed valuable knowledge and skills that made them worth employing despite their difficult personalities. The relationship between young sailors and veterans could be either mentoring or hostile depending on personalities and circumstances. Some older sailors took genuine pleasure in teaching younger ones, seeing in them the continuation of maritime tradition, finding meaning in passing on knowledge that would otherwise be lost. They corrected mistakes patiently, explained reasons behind techniques, told stories that carried practical lessons embedded in narrative. Young sailors who found such mentors were fortunate, gaining years of condensed experience that accelerated their own development. But other veterans resented younger sailors, seeing them as threats to employment in a world where age often brought declining strength and capability. These older men hoarded knowledge rather than sharing it, viewed questions as challenges to their status, made life difficult for youngsters as perhaps had been done to them when they were young. This pattern perpetuated itself across generations, creating maritime culture that could be needlessly harsh and exclusive. The most remarkable thing about these veteran sailors was perhaps their continued competence despite physical decline. A man in his 50s had neither the strength nor the speed of a man in his 20s, but he often worked more effectively through better technique, through understanding leverage and timing, through knowing when to apply force and when to use cunning. He climbed the rigging more slowly but more safely. He worked steadily rather than in bursts. He conserved energy for when it would be needed rather than expending it unnecessarily. This efficiency compensated for lost strength, allowing men to continue working effectively well past the age when those in less skilled occupations would have been forced into retirement or lighter duties. Yet eventually, inevitably, time claimed even the tougher sailors. An injury that would have been recovered from at 30 proved permanently disabling at 50. Illnesses that had been weathered before now proved fatal, or simple accumulated damage made continued work impossible. Joints too painful to move, back too damaged to lift, hands too crippled to hold rope securely. When this happened, when a sailor could no longer work aboard ship, he faced difficult choices. Some had saved money or accumulated property that could support them in retirement, but these were rare. Most depended on charity from maritime communities, on almshouses or hospitals that cared for destitute sailors, on whatever family might take them in despite years of absence and minimal support provided when they were working. A few lucky veterans found shore employment that utilised their knowledge without requiring their physical labour. They might become harbour pilots, guiding ships safely in and out of port. They might work as maritime consultants, advising merchants and ship owners. They might supervise ship construction, ensuring vessels were built according to proper principles. They might teach young sailors in formal or informal settings, passing on knowledge one more time before death finally ended their connection to the sea. These positions were prestigious and relatively well compensated, but they were few, and competition for them was intense. For the rest, retirement meant poverty and dependence, meant living on the edges of the maritime communities that had been their homes, surviving on whatever charity could be extracted from former shipmates or maritime institutions. It meant watching ships come and go, hearing news of voyages and storms, living with memories of the life they had led but could lead no longer. Some found peace in this, grateful for having survived to old age when so many had not. Others found it bitter, felt cheated by having given so much to the sea and receiving so little security in return. But bitter or peaceful, all of them carried with them the accumulated wisdom of decades at sea, understanding of wind and wave and human nature that died with them, that could never be fully captured in words or preserved in books, that existed only in the minds and bodies of those who had lived it. Distance at sea was measured differently than distance on land, calculated through methods both practical and imprecise, experienced as passage through time rather than traversal of space. Understanding how medieval sailors thought about distance reveals how intimately their worldview was shaped by the medium they travelled through, by the particular challenges and characteristics of maritime travel. On land, distance could be measured relatively precisely. A mile was defined by specific criteria, and while these definitions varied between regions, within any given area people understood what distances meant. You could count milestones along Roman roads. You could estimate distance by comparing to known journeys. The physical landmarks of land travel provided constant feedback, allowing travellers to verify their progress and correct their estimates. At sea, no such landmarks existed once land was out of sight. Distance became purely abstract, a calculation based on estimated speed multiplied by elapsed time. This calculation was subject to numerous sources of error, and these errors accumulated rapidly. If you estimated your speed as 4 knots, but were actually making 3.5, after 10 hours you would believe yourself 40 nautical miles from your starting point when actually you had covered only 35. Over days, these errors could grow to tens or hundreds of miles, enough to make the difference between finding your intended destination and missing it entirely. Speed itself was estimated using methods that seem remarkably imprecise by modern standards. The most common technique was simply observation and experience, a master who had sailed for years developed an intuitive sense of how fast the ship was moving, based on the sound of water passing the hull, the feel of the ship's motion, the appearance of the waves streaming alongside. This intuitive estimate could be surprisingly accurate, within perhaps half a knot for experienced sailors, but it was still just an estimate, subject to all the limitations of human judgment. More formal speed estimation used a chip log, though this technology was more common in later centuries than in the medieval period proper. The chip log was a wooden board attached to a rope with knots tied at regular intervals. The board was thrown overboard and allowed to drift while the ship sailed away from it. Sailors counted how many knots passed through their hands in a fixed time period, measured by a sand glass. This gave a numerical estimate of speed in knots per hour, from which the term derives. But even this more formal method was subject to error from wind, current, and human measurement in precision. Distance across open ocean thus remained fundamentally uncertain. A ship making a passage from England to Bordeaux might expect the journey to take 7 to 10 days, depending on wind, but actual duration could vary from 5 days to 2 weeks or more. Sailors learned to think about distance not in precise measurements, but in ranges and probabilities. Probably 3 days to reach a certain landmark if wind held fair, possibly 5 if wind was poor, maybe 7 if wind was contrary and they had to tack repeatedly. This uncertainty affected planning and provisions. A master had to carry enough food and water for the expected duration of the voyage, plus a substantial margin for unexpected delays. But too much margin meant excessive cost and weight, cutting into profits. Too little meant the crew might run short, threatening their health and the voyage's success. Finding the right balance required judgment informed by experience, weighing known factors against unknowable future conditions. The weight of water itself created practical constraints on how long a voyage could last. Fresh water was heavy, roughly 8 pounds per gallon, and a crew of 15 men might consume perhaps 15 gallons per day. Over 100 pounds. Carrying enough water for a 2-week voyage meant starting with more than a ton of water, occupying valuable cargo space and affecting the ship's trim and handling. As water was consumed, the ship became lighter, sat higher in the water, handled differently. Masters had to account for these changes in their sailing calculations. Running out of water at sea was a desperately serious situation. Water could not be obtained from seawater, since medieval sailors lacked desalination technology. Rain could be collected if it fell, but waiting for rain when water had run out meant dying of thirst if rain didn't come quickly enough. Some ships carried wine or ale as partial substitute for water, but these were not true replacements since they actually increased dehydration if consumed in large quantities without supplementary water. A ship that ran out of water had to make for the nearest land as quickly as possible, even if this meant abandoning the intended destination or sailing into dangerous waters. The psychological experience of distance at sea was also distinctive. On land, distance travelled could be seen and felt through changing landscape, new sights and sounds marking progress. At sea, especially in mid-ocean, each day looked much like the last. The same horizon surrounding the ship, the same endless water extending in all directions. Progress was invisible, known only through abstract calculation. This created a strange sense of stasis, as if the ship remained stationary while time flowed past, days accumulating without apparent change in position. Yet sailors developed ways of marking progress that provided psychological sustenance. They noted the changing height of the North Star, which moved higher in the sky as they sailed north or lower as they sailed south. They watched for birds and other signs that indicated they were approaching land even before land was visible. They passed known hazards or landmarks, each one confirming that their dead reckoning was approximately correct, and that they were making progress toward their destination. The moment when expected land appeared on the horizon was one of immense relief and satisfaction. Confirmation that all the estimates and calculations had been good enough, that the invisible distance had been successfully traversed. Sailors felt genuine accomplishment in such moments, having defeated the sea's vastness through skill and persistence, having brought their wooden vessel across miles of empty ocean to arrive approximately where they intended. This sense of accomplishment was deserved, given the many ways the voyage could have gone wrong, the many opportunities for error or misfortune. Yet there was humility in this accomplishment as well, recognition that success depended not just on skill but on luck, on weather that cooperated enough to allow navigation, on currents that didn't set the ship too far off course, on winds that provided steering if not speed. The best navigator in the world could not compensate for storms that lasted weeks, or currents that pushed the ship dozens of miles sideways while making forward progress. Success required both competence and grace, both human effort and circumstances beyond human control. This combination of calculation and uncertainty, of precise measurement and inevitable error, shaped how medieval sailors understood not just distance, but knowledge itself. They learned to work with imprecise information, to make good enough estimates rather than waiting for perfect knowledge, to accept uncertainty as inevitable while still striving for accuracy. They developed comfortable relationships with doubt, understanding that absolute certainty was impossible at sea, and that good judgment meant working effectively despite incomplete information. These habits of mind served them well not just in navigation, but in all aspects of maritime life, creating a practical epistemology based on evidence and experience rather than authority and theory. The sea was, among other things, a teacher. Though its lessons were harsh and its curriculum inflexible, those who learned what the sea taught tended to survive and prosper in maritime life. Those who refused or failed to learn these lessons often died, their failure serving as object lessons for others. Understanding what the sea taught and how it taught reveals something profound about the nature of wisdom and human adaptation to challenging environments. The first and perhaps most fundamental lesson was about the limits of human control. On land, humans could shape their environment significantly, building houses to shelter from weather, clearing forests to create farmland, constructing roads to ease travel. At sea, humans could do almost none of this. The wind blew or didn't blow according to its own patterns. Waves rose and fell according to physical laws that preceded human existence. Storms came without regard for human convenience or need. Sailors could work with these forces, could use wind to their advantage, and avoid the worst effects of storms through skillful navigation, but they could never control them, never command them to do their bidding. This recognition of limits was simultaneously humbling and liberating. It was humbling because it put humans in their proper place, small and vulnerable in the face of vast natural forces. But it was liberating because it freed sailors from the impossible burden of trying to control what couldn't be controlled. Instead of raging against storms or resenting contrary winds, experienced sailors learned to accept them, to work with what they were given, to find satisfaction in skillful response rather than disappointed expectations of mastery. The second lesson was about preparation and maintenance. At sea, problems that might be minor inconveniences on land could rapidly become life-threatening disasters. A frayed rope that would simply need replacing on land might part under strain at sea, leading to loss of sail control and potential capsizing. A small leak in the hull that would be annoying on land could sink a ship if not promptly repaired. The sea thus taught thoroughness, attention to detail, refusal to ignore small problems in hope they would resolve themselves. This lesson extended to provisions and planning. A voyage required not just enough supplies but excess supplies to cover unexpected delays. It required backup equipment for anything critical. It required thinking through what might go wrong and preparing responses in advance. Sailors who learned this lesson checked and rechecked, maintained and repaired constantly, planned carefully before departing. Those who didn't learn it experienced the consequences: running out of food, equipment failing at critical moments, preventable problems becoming crises. The third lesson was about community and interdependence. On land, particularly in medieval society with its rigid hierarchies and social stratifications, people could often function relatively independently, relying on family or immediate neighbours but not requiring broader community cooperation. At sea, this independence was impossible. Every sailor's survival depended on every other sailor's competence and effort. The strongest sailor couldn't save a ship single-handedly if others refused to work. The most skilled navigator couldn't prevent disaster if the crew was incompetent or mutinous. This forced interdependence taught sailors to value cooperation over competition, to prioritise group survival over individual advantage, to develop bonds of trust and mutual obligation with their shipmates. It taught them to judge people by reliability and skill rather than by social status or wealth. A nobleman who couldn't sail was worthless aboard a ship, while a commoner with maritime expertise was invaluable. This meritocratic aspect of maritime culture, while never complete or pure, was more developed than in most medieval social contexts. The fourth lesson was about patience and timing. So much of maritime life involved waiting for favourable wind, waiting for tide, waiting for weather to improve, waiting for opportunities that couldn't be forced. Impatient sailors who tried to rush things, who departed before conditions were right or took unnecessary risks to save time, often paid severely for their impatience. The sea taught that some things couldn't be hurried, that trying to force progress when conditions weren't suitable was more likely to cause disaster than to achieve goals. But the sea also taught the complementary lesson about seizing opportunities when they appeared. When wind turned favourable after days of calm, immediate action was required to take advantage before conditions changed again. When a gap appeared in storm clouds offering chance to verify position, sailors had to move quickly to take sightings before the gap closed. This combination of patience and readiness, of waiting calmly but remaining prepared to act decisively when opportunity arose, was a difficult skill to master but essential for successful seafaring. The fifth lesson was about fear and courage. The sea provided countless opportunities for fear, storms that threatened to capsize the ship, pirates that might attack, disease that could strike anyone, the constant underlying awareness that drowning might come at any moment. Sailors who couldn't manage this fear, who let it paralyze them or drive them to panic, endangered themselves and their shipmates. The sea taught that courage wasn't absence of fear, but rather effective functioning despite fear, keeping your head when circumstances were terrifying, doing what needed to be done even when every instinct screamed to hide or flee. This courage wasn't showy or dramatic, but rather quiet and persistent. The courage to climb aloft during a storm when every rational calculation suggested the mast might break. The courage to stay at your post when exhausted beyond belief. The courage to make difficult decisions knowing you might be wrong, and people might die because of your error. It was courage grounded in duty and necessity, rather than in hope of glory or recognition. Courage that became so routine it was barely recognised as courage at all, but rather just as normal response to circumstances. The sixth lesson was about mortality and acceptance. Death at sea was common enough that every sailor knew men who had died, had witnessed drownings or fatal accidents, had themselves survived situations that might easily have killed them. This constant proximity to death could have made sailors nihilistic or reckless. But more commonly it produced a kind of philosophical acceptance, recognition that death would come eventually, and that worrying about it excessively was pointless and counterproductive. This acceptance didn't mean sailors were careless with their lives or indifferent to survival. Rather, it meant they could think clearly about danger without being overwhelmed by it, could assess risks rationally and take necessary chances when the potential gain justified the danger. It meant they could face storms and battles and all the sea's many hazards with calm determination rather than paralytic terror. And it meant that when death did come, whether to themselves or their shipmates, they could meet it with dignity and grace rather than desperate denial. These lessons, learned through years of experience and reinforced by countless examples, both positive and negative, shaped sailors' characters in distinctive ways. They became pragmatic and realistic, neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but rather focused on what actually was rather than what might be hoped for or feared. They became attentive to detail while keeping sight of larger patterns, able to focus on immediate tasks while maintaining awareness of the broader situation. They became comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, working effectively despite incomplete information and unknown outcomes. And perhaps most importantly, they became humble before forces larger than themselves, while simultaneously confident in their own skills and knowledge. This paradoxical combination, humility about what they couldn't control paired with confidence about what they could, characterized the best sailors and was perhaps the most valuable lesson the sea taught. Know your limits, work within them skillfully, and accept the results with grace, whether favourable or otherwise. Every sailor who returned from a voyage carried with him more than cargo and wages. He carried stories, experiences transformed into narrative, events shaped by memory and telling into accounts that entertained, instructed, and connected maritime communities across distance and time. Understanding the role of storytelling in medieval maritime culture reveals how knowledge was preserved and transmitted, how communities maintained cohesion, and how individual experience became collective memory. The stories sailors told were of several types, each serving different functions. The most common were simple narratives of recent voyages. Where the ship had gone, what cargo she had carried, what weather had been encountered, what ports had been visited. These stories were partly practical information, intelligence about conditions and opportunities that helped other sailors and merchants make decisions. But they were also entertainment, ways of passing time in taverns and harbour-front gatherings, providing connection between men who shared the maritime life even if they had never sailed together. Storm stories occupied a special category, narratives of survival against impossible odds, of ships battered but ultimately victorious over waves that seemed certain to sink them. These stories followed patterns, certain elements appearing repeatedly. The sudden onset of bad weather, the mounting waves, the crucial moment when disaster seemed inevitable. The eventual survival through skill or luck or divine intervention. The patterns weren't formulaic copying, but rather reflected common structure in actual maritime experience, the way storms really did develop and play out at sea. Yet the telling shaped the stories in important ways. Details that seemed most significant got emphasized and elaborated. Sequence got reorganized for maximum dramatic effect. Emotions got foregrounded or backgrounded depending on what the storyteller wanted to communicate. The result was narratives that were simultaneously true and constructed, faithful to actual events while being shaped by the requirements of storytelling and the purposes of the teller. Disaster stories, accounts of ships lost and men drowned, served different purposes than survival narratives. They were cautionary tales, examples of what happened when proper procedures weren't followed or when luck ran out. They preserved memory of dead sailors and lost ships, ensuring they weren't entirely forgotten, and they provided emotional processing of trauma, ways for survivors to work through their experiences of loss and near death by transforming them into narratives that could be shared and understood. Comic stories lightened the mood, accounts of mishaps and misunderstandings, of drunken escapades in foreign ports, of practical jokes played on unsuspecting shipmates. These stories celebrated the lighter side of maritime life, the camaraderie and mischief that made hardship bearable. They often featured stock characters, the naive young sailor learning harsh lessons, the grizzled veteran who had seen everything, the unscrupulous merchant trying to cheat honest seamen, the foreign official who could be bribed or outwitted. Hero stories celebrated individual sailors who had demonstrated exceptional skill or courage, the navigator who had guided the ship safely through impossible conditions, the sailor who had saved a shipmate from drowning, the master who had outmaneuvered pirates or negotiated brilliantly with foreign merchants. These stories served to define and reinforce maritime values, to show what the community admired and aspired to. to provide models that younger sailors could emulate. Ghost stories and tales of the supernatural were their own category, accounts of phantom ships and sea monsters, of strange lights and mysterious sounds, of encounters with forces that defied normal explanation. These stories were sometimes told with full belief in their truth, sometimes with deliberate ambiguity about whether they were fact or fiction. They addressed the mystery and fear that the sea inevitably inspired, giving form to anxieties about the unknown, providing frameworks for understanding experiences that didn't fit normal categories. The telling itself was performative, not just communication of information but entertainment and social bonding. Good storytellers used voice and gesture, modulating their delivery to match the narrative, building tension and releasing it, timing their revelations for maximum effect. Audiences participated actively, asking questions, offering comments, sometimes challenging or correcting details. The best stories were told and retold, gradually becoming polished through repetition, with the most effective phrasings and structures surviving, while less effective elements were dropped or revised. Stories also travelled. Carried from port to port by sailors who had heard them elsewhere, a story about pirates in the Mediterranean might reach the Baltic through multiple retellings, changing slightly with each iteration, but maintaining its essential structure. A navigation technique used in one region might spread to others through stories of how it had been successfully employed. Tales of particularly rich or dangerous ports spread through maritime networks, affecting where sailors were willing to go and what precautions they took. Some stories achieved such wide circulation that they became part of general maritime folklore, known in multiple versions across different linguistic and cultural regions. The story of the Flying Dutchman, a ghost ship condemned to sail forever, existed in various forms throughout Northern European maritime culture. Stories of mermaids and sea serpents appeared across cultures, suggesting either genuine sightings of unusual marine life or deeply rooted psychological responses to the mystery of the sea. Written versions of maritime stories were rare in the medieval period, since literacy was limited and most storytelling was oral. But some stories did get written down, incorporated into chronicles or travel accounts, preserved in forms that allowed them to survive beyond the memories of those who originally told them. These written versions became canonical in some sense, fixing stories that had been fluid, creating definitive versions against which oral variants could be measured. The stories sailors carried home served ultimately to connect the maritime world to the land-based world, to help those who hadn't been to sea understand something of what sailors experienced, to maintain family and community bonds despite long absences. When a sailor returned home and his children asked where he had been and what he had done, the answers came in story form, not dry recitations of facts, but narratives with shape and meaning, with drama and humour and lesson. These stories were gifts given to families and communities, ways of sharing experiences that couldn't be directly shared, bridges across the gap between those who went to sea and those who remained ashore. And in the telling and retelling of these stories, maritime culture reproduced itself, passing knowledge and values from generation to generation, creating continuity across time and space. Young boys hearing stories of the sea from fathers or uncles or family friends absorbed not just information about maritime life, but values and attitudes, expectations and aspirations. Some of these boys would become sailors themselves, carrying forward the traditions they had learned through stories, eventually becoming storytellers in their turn, passing the culture onward to another generation. The cycle continued, unbroken, connecting medieval sailors to their predecessors and successors in a chain of narrative that stretched backward into the unrecorded past and forward toward futures none of them could imagine. Imagine, if you will, a medieval merchant ship at the end of a voyage, having delivered her cargo safely, now resting at anchor in a familiar harbour as the sun sets behind the hills. The crew's work is done for the day, their shares calculated and paid, their immediate needs met. They gather on deck in the evening light, not yet ready to go ashore, savouring this moment of transition between the voyage just completed and whatever comes next. In this scene, in this quiet moment after labour and before rest, we find something essential about medieval maritime life that transcends the practical and historical, something that speaks to universal human experience of work and community, journey and arrival, striving and peace. The light at this hour is golden and soft, transforming the ordinary harbour into something beautiful and strange. The water reflects the sky, holding the sun's fading colours, rippling gently with the ship's slight motion. Other ships rest at anchor nearby, their masts and rigging making dark patterns against the luminous sky. From shore comes the sound of the town settling into evening, church bells ringing the hour, voices calling to each other, the occasional dog barking, all the normal sounds of human habitation that had been absent during weeks at sea. The sailors sit or stand in small groups, talking quietly among themselves or simply resting in silence. They are exhausted, bone-tired from the voyage's labour, but it is a good exhaustion, the tiredness that comes from work completed rather than work abandoned. Their bodies ache in familiar ways, backs stiff from lifting, hands sore from rope, shoulders tight from tension. But these discomforts are almost comforting in their familiarity, proof of work done, of survival through another voyage. Tomorrow will bring new concerns, repairs to be arranged, equipment to be replaced, cargo to be sought for the next voyage, crew positions to be filled as some men leave and others must be recruited. But tonight these concerns can wait. Tonight belongs to the satisfaction of arrival, to the simple joy of being safe in harbour after time at sea, to the peace that comes from surviving another voyage and earning another share and having nothing urgent demanding immediate attention. The philosophical dimension of this moment deserves reflection. Medieval sailors participated in one of the oldest human activities, the movement of goods across water, connecting communities separated by the sea. They did this work knowing it was dangerous, knowing many who started voyages never completed them, knowing the hardships were severe and the rewards often meagre, yet they continued, voyage after voyage, year after year, creating the maritime trade networks that tied the medieval world together, that moved not just cargo but ideas and culture, that made cities and nations economically viable by connecting them to resources and markets they couldn't reach overland. In doing this work, sailors developed particular virtues and particular wisdom. They learned patience and persistence, courage and cooperation, practical skill and philosophical acceptance. They learned to work with uncertainty, to make decisions with incomplete information, to live with danger without being paralysed by it. They learned the limits of human control while simultaneously demonstrating human capability within those limits. They learned to find satisfaction in craft well practiced, in community well maintained, in challenges successfully met even when success brought no glory beyond the fact of survival. These lessons had value beyond maritime life, though sailors might not have articulated it this way. The habits of mind and character developed at sea served them in all aspects of life, in family relationships, in community participation, in facing whatever challenges life presented. A sailor who had learned patience by waiting for favourable wind could apply that patience to other situations requiring it. One who had learned courage by climbing the mast during storms could call on that courage in other frightening circumstances. One who had learned to work cooperatively with shipmates could collaborate effectively in other contexts requiring teamwork. But perhaps the deepest wisdom sailors acquired was about the nature of human existence itself, about our place in a world of forces larger than ourselves, about the proper balance between ambition and acceptance, between effort and grace. At sea, this balance became obvious in ways it might not be on land. No amount of human effort could create favourable wind if wind didn't blow. No degree of skill could prevent all disasters if luck turned bad. Yet effort and skill mattered immensely, making the difference between success and failure in situations where both were possible outcomes. This recognition that human agency was real but limited, that we must try our best while accepting that our best might not be enough, that wisdom meant neither helpless passivity nor arrogant overconfidence, but rather skilled engagement within acknowledged constraints. This recognition was not unique to sailors, but was perhaps more accessible to them than to most medieval people. The sea taught it daily, hourly, in ways too obvious to ignore or deny. And sailors who learned it well carried this wisdom with them, informing their approach to life in all its aspects. As full darkness approaches, as stars begin to appear in the deepening blue above, the sailors prepare for sleep. Some will go below, finding spaces among the cargo where they have rested before. Others will remain on deck, wrapping themselves in cloaks, using coiled rope as pillows. The watch will be set, ensuring someone remains alert even in harbour, though tonight's watch will be relaxed and informal, more presence than vigilance. And gradually, one by one, the crew will sleep, their breathing synchronizing with the ship's gentle motion, their dreams a mix of memory and anticipation, of sea and shore, of past and future meeting in the suspended present of this quiet evening. The ship herself rests on the water, a wooden island in the dark harbour, her timbers creaking softly with the rhythm of the tide, her mast pointing toward the stars. She is scarred and worn from her years of service, her planks stained and weathered, her sail patched many times over. But she is sound, maintained by the care of successive crews, built well enough that with proper attention she might serve for decades more. She has carried thousands of tons of cargo, transported hundreds of sailors, survived storms and calms and all the sea's varying moods, and she will continue, bearing her wooden witness to the human endeavour of maritime trade, participating in the ancient and ongoing conversation between humans and the sea. We've travelled together now for more than 2 hours, drifting across medieval waters, stepping aboard wooden ships that existed centuries ago, meeting the men who sailed them and learning about the lives they led. From the construction of the vessels themselves to the relationships between masters and crew, from the practical challenges of navigation and provisioning to the deeper questions of meaning and wisdom that maritime life raised. We've explored what it meant to live between wood and wave, to make your living from the sea, to be part of the ancient community of sailors who connected the medieval world. But it was also more than just hardship and skill and community. It was a way of life that taught profound lessons about human limits and human capability, about cooperation and courage, about patience and persistence. It was participation in something larger than any individual voyage or sailor, contribution to the trade networks that sustained medieval economy and culture. It was engagement with fundamental questions about human relationship to nature, about our ability to work with forces we cannot control, about finding meaning in labour that was often harsh but occasionally touched with something beautiful and true. The medieval sailors we've come to know through these hours were not heroes in the conventional sense, not men whose names are remembered or whose deeds were celebrated in chronicles. They were working people doing difficult jobs for modest compensation, risking their lives repeatedly for what would strike us today as inadequate reward. Yet they continued, generation after generation, choosing or accepting maritime life, becoming skilled at it, finding satisfaction in it despite everything. Their choice to continue, their persistence in the face of hardship, their competence in practicing a dangerous craft, all of these deserve recognition and respect. If you enjoyed this slow drift through maritime history, if these quiet hours exploring life at sea brought you some measure of peace, or interest, or understanding, a like and subscribe helps others discover these same calm explorations. The comment section welcomes your thoughts, your own connections to maritime history, your reflections on what we've discussed. And to those who have been here before, who regularly join these gentle journeys through history, thank you. Your presence makes this community possible. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever time it is as you listen to these words, I hope you're comfortable. I hope your breathing has slowed to match the rhythm of these contemplative waters. I hope your thoughts, which might have been racing when we began, have quieted to gentle currents. I hope your body feels heavy and warm, settled into wherever you're resting, ready to let go of waking consciousness and drift into sleep. Look up at the stars if you can, or imagine them if you cannot. Picture them as medieval sailors saw them, blazing with intensity undimmed by light pollution, familiar patterns rotating across the sky, guides and companions and reminders of order in the chaotic world. Those same stars shine tonight that guided ships across medieval waters. The constellation sailors used to navigate remain unchanged, connecting our present to their past, reminding us that some things persist despite all the changes that centuries bring. All those medieval sailors, all those voyages completed or lost, all those ships that crossed dangerous waters carrying precious cargo and vulnerable human lives, they're part of history now, preserved in the written records they left behind and in the stories we tell about them. But they were real people once, as real as you or I, facing real challenges, experiencing real fear and real satisfaction. Living lives that mattered to them even if history has largely forgotten their names. We honour them by remembering, by trying to understand what their lives were like, by recognising the courage and skill that allowed them to survive, and the humanity they shared with us despite the centuries that separate their time from ours. Perhaps what we've learned tonight, if we've learned anything, is that human beings have always been capable of remarkable things, that our ancestors faced challenges we can barely imagine with grace and competence, that the virtues that matter, courage and persistence and cooperation and wisdom, haven't changed even as technology and society have transformed beyond recognition. The medieval sailor and the modern person share more than separates them. The need for community, the desire for meaningful work, the capacity to endure hardship, the ability to find satisfaction in craft well practiced and challenges well met. Sleep well tonight then. Dream of wooden ships and open waters, of horizons both literal and metaphorical, of the space between earth and heaven where medieval sailors lived their working lives. Dream of oak and canvas, of salt and spray, of the sound of wind through rigging and waves against the hull. Dream of the satisfaction that comes from safe arrival after dangerous passage, of rest earned through labour, of peace found through acceptance of limits and skilled engagement within them. Dream of being part of something larger than yourself, contributing to the great human project of connecting and sustaining our communities despite the obstacles distance and danger place in our path. And when you wake tomorrow, may you carry something of tonight's journey with you. Perhaps a bit of the patience sailors learned by waiting for favourable wind, perhaps some of the courage they demonstrated by repeatedly facing danger, perhaps a measure of the wisdom they acquired through acceptance of what they couldn't control paired with skilled effort toward what they could achieve. May you find satisfaction in your own work as they found satisfaction in theirs, and may you face your challenges with something of the quiet competence and persistence that characterise the best of them. Good night. May your sleep be deep and dreamless, or if dreams come, may they be gentle ones. May tomorrow greet you rested and renewed, carrying forward the peace and understanding these hours have offered. The voyage is complete, the harbour is reached. Rest now, as those medieval sailors rested after their voyages, with the satisfaction of having made it through, of having learned something worth knowing, of having participated, however briefly, in the ancient and ongoing human relationship with the sea.